Okay, it is now 7 o'clock. I'd like to call to order the Committee of the Whole meeting for the City of Urbana City Council for Monday, March 3rd, 2025. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Wu.
Here.
Councilmember Evans.
Here.
Councilmember Hersey. Councilmember Colasetti.
Here.
Councilmember Bishop. Councilmember Wilkin.
Here.
Councilmember Quisenberry.
Here.
Mayor Marlin.
Here.
Seeing we have a quorum, we will next go to the approval of minutes of the previous meeting for February 3rd, 2025. Does anyone have any substantial changes? Seeing none, do I have a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
Moved by Mary Alice, seconded by James. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Or beep. That motion passes. Those minutes are approved. Any additions to the agenda? Seeing none, we will move on to presentations. Seeing none, we will go right to public input. If anybody has public input, please step forward to the microphone. You have 5 minutes. And please state your name for the record.
Say to have be read aloud. The main point of it is that I think that the sort of resolution or the ordinance on surveillance, I think that a lot of the conversation last week was about sort of what constitutes surveillance and what's investigation. And I just wanted to sort of say that I think in this world where surveillance is becoming all too often, what I see this ordinance is doing is putting the power of what surveillance technologies are being used in the hands of the public and in your hands. And as far as I can tell, if there was new surveillance technology like almost omnipotent eye in Batman, that if the cops asked for it and gave you a proposal, you could still choose to pass it. This doesn't limit any technology that the police department could use. It simply says that the public is going to know what's being used, and there's going to be a plan on how it's going to be used. And I think that it's really important that we focus on the fact that this isn't a discussion about which technology should be used. It's not a discussion of like, what does surveillance even mean? But even just the conversation of it has led us to know that there is some surveillance that's happening, and it allows the public to sort of know more and allows the public to be in a little more control of what surveillance technology is used. And I think that that's inherently a good thing. And then where you draw that line is something that I think it makes a lot of sense for you to sort of talk a little bit about and make sure that you're not putting too much administrative burden on yourselves. But in its ideal form, this is simply to say the public should know what surveillance is being used, and we should get to say yes or no on the technology being used here in this town. And I think that's a really good thing. And so then you can figure out how to do that best as a city, but I really appreciate you sort of taking the time to figure that out. And I hope that you end up finding a good line and passing it. So thanks so much and have a nice night.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to address the council? And please state your name for the record.
Hi, dear City Council members and Mayor Marlin. My name is Carol Spindell. I live at 608 West Delaware, Urbana. And I come before you as the Director of Communications for the ACLU of Champaign County. We represent over 18 member households, and ACLU has been involved with the draft ordinance, and we support its passage. There seems to be some confusion and hyperbole about the goal of this ordinance and its effect on the police department. No one wants to micromanage the police. No one wants to block the department from acquiring useful new technology. However, Urbana residents have made it clear that they do want a police department that is accountable to our community, and we do want some control over how our personal data is used, stored, and potentially marketed. We have only one mechanism to hold the police department accountable: our elected representatives, you, all of you. Under the terms of the ordinance, if the police department wants to acquire new surveillance technology, they come to the council and explain what the technology does, why it is important to acquire it, And most importantly, to the Urbana residents we have spoken with, what the company leasing the technology to the police department can and cannot do with the personal data they collect. Right now, the entire country is concerned about someone without legal authority rampaging through their personal data stored at the national level. Yikes. We never gave our permission for that. It's clear that Americans want guardrails placed around their data to protect it, to specify how law enforcement can use it, and to protect their personal information from private companies that may want to profit from its sale. We don't know what technology will be invented and marketed to law enforcement in the future. AI, who knows? But with this ordinance in place, we will be able to find out before its acquisition and to have a say in whether we approve of this surveillance being conducted on us in our community. We'll be able to understand what protections the tech company, which of course is organized to maximize profit, provides to assure us that our data, if not involved in any criminal investigation, will be sufficiently protected from misuse. We deeply appreciate your service to our wonderful town and the attention that you and the staff and the police department have devoted to this issue. ACLU urges you to pass the ordinance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to address the council? Please state your name for the record.
I'm Jane McClintock. I'm a resident of Urbana, and I wanted to speak on the same thing that Carol was just speaking on from ACLU. I would like to urge you to pass this resolution requiring a public process for surveillance, and just remind you all that this is something that I think it's just a basic common sense measure that we would have a conversation about what kind of technology it is and have a policy in place. It wouldn't require us to. This doesn't ban any kind of technology. It doesn't tie anyone's hands. And in fact, we've been seeing all these interesting presentations of these kind of interesting antiquated technologies. But I wanted to just say that, just remind you that this doesn't apply to anything which is not in use. So, we wouldn't have to dig through the closets to see, what might possibly be used as surveillance, because it only applies to technologies which are being used. And then I also wanted to talk about one technology that was on the list that I think is a good example of why this would be a good idea, and something that I'm somewhat concerned about. Not even to necessarily say we shouldn't be using it, but that we should be careful about how we use it, and that's social media tracking. It's something that I think is very, it has the potential to be used in a way that would find people associated with a person to have consequences based on that other person's behavior. For instance, if somebody was, doing drug dealing or something bad, that those people associated with them in social media might face consequences if it wasn't used carefully. So therefore, having a careful policy could make sure that we're not running into civil liberties issues like collective punishment or, consequences by association with somebody, which I think could happen easily. And also, even these tech companies, we don't really know, what is their algorithm for tracking, and without doing an annual report, we might find that some bias comes in and that unintentionally we're actually tracking mostly people of color or mostly young people or only students or only community members. And so I think doing that, having a basic policy in place and doing that kind of tracking would help us to use that technology in a smart way where, it might be really useful. If someone keeps having noise complaints, that maybe it's a good idea for the police department to know ahead of time when they're planning a party. But if somebody hasn't done anything yet, I don't think it would be appropriate for the police to track whether they're having a party or not. So I think having a policy for something like that would be really useful. But there isn't really that many technologies that it would apply to, and I don't think it will be a very big burden. And I think this is just a common sense thing. And we've had a lot of time for input. I appreciate all the work that Grace has done and the suggestion that Chandra had for the exigent circumstances. And I think this is the time to get this across the finish line. If as we implement it, we have other ideas, we want to make it even better, we can always go back. But we don't have to, have anticipated everything to get the ball rolling on this and learn from getting going on it. So I urge you guys to vote yes for this, and I appreciate all the hard work on it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Reminder to please state your name for the record.
Hi, I'm Brian Maxwell. I live over on East Elm Street. So first I want to say thanks to the police department and the city administration, because over the last couple of weeks, I think there has been an effort on being transparent about some of the technologies that are being used in the city. And I think that's kind of in line with what the ordinance is trying to do. Make these a transparent process, make it so that people in the city can hear about what technologies are being used, and we can have this kind of debate about how we want them to be used. So I appreciate that. After that discussion last week, I think there was some debate about whether or not the technologies used in other departments outside the police department should also fall within the ordinance. And it came up during that that the city uses Placer AI as one of these technologies. You know, kind of like I talked about last week with Cellebrite, Placer AI is another one of these surveillance softwares that was developed by Israel and basically developed on a captive population of about 2 million Palestinians. This is another, surveillance technology that is been associated with human rights abuses. I would say that this is kind of more surveillance-y than the Cellebrite software. I mean, Cellebrite, there's a kind of an investigative tool aspect to it where someone has to be detained. You're kind of accessing someone's phone who's under investigation. I mean, Placer AI is really indiscriminate mass surveillance. I'm not saying that's how the city uses it. I know that's not how the city uses it, but that is what that software is based on. There is some debate about whether or not this data is anonymized, whether it's not anonymous data or not. So the location data that it provides, it is anonymous in the sense that it doesn't say that this location data coming up from, someone wants to look up who's visiting a Meijer and where they're going to after. It doesn't say, this person is Brian Maxwell, that's his phone. But it's basically giving information on where that person is coming to and where that person is going to after. So, if I look up the location data for a Meijers, for a city building, for, any location, and I see where that person is going to afterwards and is at between the hours of 10 at night and 8 in the morning, you have a pretty good sense of who that is and where they live. And some of these tools are actually really powerful because they're backed by machine learning, AI. They make associations between different people's devices, whether or not it's anonymized or not, but making relationships between location data. And I'm bringing this up because this isn't just hypothetical about how this is being used and could be used. Back in 2022, Congress and the FTC specifically went to go regulate Placer AI because between 2020 and 2022, it was found that private users, purchasing Placer AI's data, were able to look up the location data on 17 different Planned Parenthood clinics, and 5 of these in Michigan, Illinois, and Minnesota. So any user can get on and look at the location data for a given place and then see, where these people are going to after they live, say, a Planned Parenthood clinic. And that was how some people were using. I'm not saying that the city uses it that way, but that is, the extent of how powerful this technology is. And people can't really opt out of that. Placer AI doesn't share what apps that it buys that location data from. It doesn't share what apps it essentially has partnerships that it can purchase that data from. So anyone in the city can't decide whether or not it wants to share its data with this company. It's essentially, just given to by common apps on people's phones that you can really only not give information to if you just turn off the location services on your phone. So it is a really powerful tool. I think these technologies should definitely fall under the scope of this ordinance, because I really don't know how a lot of people in this town would feel about the fact that our local taxes are basically being used to subsidize a foreign government's ability to surveil location data on private citizens. So I think that should fall under the scope of the ordinance. So I'm about out of time. So thanks for the time. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to address the council? Reminder to please state your name for the record.
Hello, City Council. My name is Sarah Nixon. I'm here in support and want to thank Councilwoman Wilkins for taking action on behalf of the people of Urbana to establish basic checks and balances. So thank you for that. And I came here to speak in support of the proposed ordinance because I do want law enforcement to have appropriate tools, and I want them to use these tools appropriately with appropriate oversight by their employers, by all of us. Law enforcement work for the people, not against the people. We do need oversight to ensure excellence in policing. We have a history in Urbana of police misconduct, of police abuse of technology, misused in order to do actual harm to residents. I was surprised by the intentional omissions in the presentation recently given to council on the current state of investigative tools available to the UPD by Deputy Chief Smizer. Urbana police have access to police surveillance technology, to state police surveillance technology, and he chose not to mention that. Urbana police have access to Champaign Police Department surveillance technology and the University of Illinois' arsenal of surveillance devices. He chose not to mention that. The UPD can access the FBI and other federal agencies' surveillance technology, including information and data from third-party investigative platforms. He chose not to share all of that and instead presented magnifying glasses and flashlights and so on. In reality, there is an arguably vast array of tools, databases, and technologies that UPD has at their fingertips for any investigation, and they can and do access those. Police training includes schooling on how to lie and how to misrepresent truths and facts. City Council, when you are taking in police presentations and assertions, please don't ever forget that. I would also like to talk to you about domestic violence and my very dear recently murdered friend and former coworker Rick Meeks, stabbed to death a few days before Valentine's Day by his longtime abuser Sharon Moore, who is now finally in custody. Where if the criminal justice system does its job, which it hasn't done until to this point, she will remain for a long time and no longer present a public threat for that duration of time. He had threatened others with stabbing. Rick's case was recently knowingly misrepresented to the media by Julia Reitz as quote-unquote gun violence. But domestic violence, but guns played no role in Rick's senseless, violent death, a knife and domestic violence, and drug abuse. And most importantly, a system that continuously fails domestic violence victims every day. That is what killed Rick. But Reitz instead played on the public sphere of guns for political points. Sharon Moore's rap sheet is like a mile long, beginning with drug offenses, a litany or multitude of drug offenses, and escalating to assault with deadly weapon. Rick had attempted to seek protection from Sharon Moore from her violent, murderous rage. He had been to court numerous times in the past. And that's actually how his murder was solved. I think the term is gumshoe, good old-fashioned gumshoe. The police looked into his name, looked into the dockets and found that Sharon Moore would be a person of interest. That's what I'm told by those closest to Rick and his neighbors. And they also used neighbors' surveillance video from their doors, which, Ring cameras and so on, which I am in favor of. But his murder was solved through old-fashioned detective work. When I'm out of time, I just want you to know that Rick was the salt of the earth, and whenever he would come into work beaten up, scratched up, with chunks of hair missing, I would urge him to get that order of protection. He had petitioned for one, and it was denied.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to speak to the council?
I'm James Kilgore, a resident of Urbana. A few years ago, I remember coming to one of these meetings that had to do with surveillance. And a company representative came in here trying to sell us automatic license plate readers. And someone asked him what were the Fourth Amendment implications of license plate readers. And his response was, "Could you remind me again what the Fourth Amendment says?" So I think we've come a long way from that point. I think we have a very sophisticated corporate agenda driving this technology. And I'm very proud of the city of Urbana, or the city council, for taking up this policy, for putting together what is pretty much a cutting edge kind of initiative to look at the implications of surveillance technology and to build in structures of accountability to where the residents and the city council can find out exactly what's happening with the technology that's being put into place. So I hope the city council will take that into consideration, because this is a long haul piece, this technology. We're at the very start of AI, right? And I don't think we can afford to just leave the door open for the purveyors of this technology to do whatever they want. So I'm really enthusiastic about the ordinance, which will make it imperative that the city council does proper research on any technology that's surveillance or investigation. And I think that difference between those two is a little bit hazy and probably needs more exploration. Secondly, that the ordinance would require an annual report to the city council on how this technology was being used. And that's where the structure of accountability comes in. Because one of the things that often happens when you're dealing with an issue like this is that there may be one or two people on the city council for whom this is a very high-level priority. But then if there's no ordinance, no structure of making those who are implementing this accountable, when the one or two people disappear, all of a sudden it's as if the whole episode never happened. I don't think we can afford to do that at this point in Urbana, or anywhere for that matter. We need accountability. We need structures like annual reporting. We need more research capacity for decision-making bodies to look into this technology. So I hope you will pass this ordinance and continue the spirit of this ordinance into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to address the council? Seeing none, we will go on to the next item, and that, we have readings to do, right. Go ahead, Jaya.
All right. The following was asked to be read aloud. I, Lila Leopold, Urbana resident, Ward 4, write in continued support of the Police Surveillance Technology Oversight Ordinance authored by Alderperson Grace Wilkin of Ward 6. I thank all members of council for your continued discussion and serious consideration of this ordinance at tonight's meeting. This ordinance can play a crucial role in maintaining open and honest communication in our community. This seems only increasingly important as our current federal administration attempts to turn more and more of our public sector jobs over to private sector decision-making that may happen above and beyond the purview of any of our local law enforcement or government agencies. I hope council members and our local police leaders can see this ordinance as an urgently needed safety component for working with tools that we neither design nor control. Thank you, council, for continuing your discussion of this ordinance, which seems a necessary and forward-thinking component of 21st century governance. Sincerely, Lila Leopold.
Thank you. I have another one. My name is Sana Sabuala. I live in Ward 2. I am a member of the CU Muslim Action Committee here locally. I am writing in support of the surveillance ordinance. Thank you, Councilmember Wilkin, for bringing this conversation to our attention and pushing us to put these protections in place as a city. This surveillance ordinance doesn't limit the city in any way. City Council can always approve the use of surveillance technology, but this ordinance's requirement that it be documented and approved is an important step towards accountability and transparency. I'm proud to live in a city that values transparency, especially transparency around policing, and enacting this ordinance is a reflection of that commitment. Thank you for taking this issue seriously. I hope you pass this measure. Best, Sana Sabuala. And I have one more to read. Dear City Council, I'd like to get your attention for just a couple of minutes while I raise some points that I'd like you to think about. The results of the primaries are in, and I'd like everyone on council to take note of them. This is an opportunity to hear from all voters, not just the ones who show up and submit public input. Even in wards that were uncontested, the mayoral race tells us something about what your constituents want. A few months ago, one council member made a passing comment about the same people showing up for public input and advocating for the same things. The insinuation was that the people who are politically active do not represent the city as a whole. At the time, it was hard to tell if that was accurate. Are the people giving public input out of touch with their larger community? Obviously, they do not think so, but based on the votes of some council members, some on council disagreed. Now that we have the election results, we see that there is overwhelming support for community oversight before automated license plate readers are purchased and installed. The voters do not favor huge increases in government spending on police. On all of the controversial issues, the views you've heard during public input are also supported by the majority of the voters. So if you were one of the council members who listened to the public comments about spending on police, acknowledged that over 95% of them were against sharp increases, and then proceeded to vote for expanding the police force because you thought the activists were out of touch, please reconsider. Your constituents need you to represent them. This is true whether or not they have time to engage with you during public input. I urge you to pass the amended version of the ordinance that is brought before you tonight. It's clear that the people in your ward support the policies you've been advocating for. Keep up the good work. And this is from Adam. And any others? Okay, so that concludes, finally now, public input, and we will go on to the next thing. Next item is a staff report. the City of Urbana and Urbana Home Consortium Consolidated Plan for 2025 to 2029, and the Annual Action Plan for 2025 to 2026, brought by the Community Development. And Braden Belcher, you have the floor when you're ready, sir.
The slides are easier. Good evening, everyone. So tonight we'll be providing a staff report on our draft 2025 through 2029 consolidated plan and the 2025 through 2026 annual action plan, which is included as a component of the consolidated plan. For those of you who have been on council for a while, you know that every year we come to you with our annual action plan, which outlines how we intend to utilize our HUD resources over the upcoming fiscal year. This is an exciting time because we're also bringing to you now our next 5-year plan, which outlines sort of those high-level 5-year goals that we intend to implement utilizing HUD resources over the next 5 years. So the intention of this presentation is to provide a very high-level overview of the draft plan. The plan is included in your packet. It was printed for public review on February 24th, and it will be available for public review until March 25th. During that 30-day period, we are actively soliciting feedback from the community on the draft plan. We would love to hear from you and also from members of the community on the priorities that have been identified and for ideas or input on how we can utilize these funds to make an impact for low-income households in our community. So just to start with that high-level overview, this planning process is a requirement that the city undertakes as an entitlement grantee of Community Development Block Grant and Home Investment Partnership funding, which we receive from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So it is a required component, but beyond that, it's an extremely important part of our programs to engage in this annual and then 5-year process of soliciting feedback, studying needs, gathering information, to have a better idea of what are the needs that low-income households in our community are facing, and how can the resources that we have available be utilized to meet those needs. So this planning process, again, it's very central to that process. So just as a refresher, again, we do present this every year just on a background of what these federal resources can be used to support in our community. So again, as I mentioned, the 5-year consolidated plan and the annual action plan guide the use of our Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG, funding and our Home Investment Partnership funding. Both of these programs provide resources to the city that can be used for a wide variety of low-income community development needs and also affordable housing needs in our community. So the Community Development Block Grant, just real quick, it's a very flexible pot of funding that we receive. It can be used to support public services for low-income households, public infrastructure and facility improvements in our low-income targeted areas, economic development activities, and also low-income housing rehabilitation programs. The Home Investment Partnership, similarly, can be used to support affordable housing, including our tenant-based rental assistance program, the construction or rehabilitation of affordable housing, both homeowner housing and also rental housing as well, and then also funding for community housing development organizations, or CHODOs. So as I referenced, the consolidated plan is sort of the 5-year strategic plan that we put together to show what are those kind of long-term goals that we hope to address with these sources of funding over the next 5 years. That the consolidated plan within the document contains that first-year annual action plan. So you'll notice it's a very long document. It's 141 pages. That's why it's the consolidated plan and our first-year annual action plan combined in one document. And then over the subsequent 4 years, every year we come back to you with another annual action plan, which again, those are essentially our 1-year implementation guides for how we're going to be implementing those kind of bigger 5-year goals that we've identified. So as you'll notice as you read through the plan, and I encourage you all to read through it, there's a lot of great information in there if I do say so myself. The way the plan is structured is the consolidated plan really starts with high-level priority needs. And then as you read through the plan, it kind of goes down into more granular, breaking those down into more specific goals and then the projects that we intend to undertake in order to meet those bigger priority needs that we've identified. So as you read through the plan, that's kind of the flow of the document that you'll notice. So I'll just briefly walk through, again, the long document. I've highlighted some of the key areas where some of these things are called out that you can see in the draft document. So at the beginning of the consolidated plan, beginning on page 11, we describe our public participation process, all of the activities that we undertake to solicit and to record feedback from the community. A needs assessment begins on page 12. This is a very important part of the plan because this is where we're really analyzing what are the needs in the community. And Nick will go into a little bit more detail on that process and the data that we gather. But it's really a qualitative and quantitative section of the plan, right? It's important for us to get that feedback from the community, but we also want to be looking at data to see what that's telling us as well. Beginning on page 49 is a housing market analysis, which again looks at affordable housing in our community, identifies needs, identifies gaps, and that's another very important part that Nick will talk briefly about as well. And then a breakdown of those priority needs and goals that I mentioned begins on page 81. We identify what those goals are, we describe them, and then as you go through the document, we describe how we're intending to meet those goals and to meet those needs. Another very important part, anticipated resources. That section begins on page 94 of the consolidated plan, so that's where we talk about the resources we anticipate receiving to support the projects that we've identified in the plan. The annual action plan is structured similarly. Again, it's built on those priority needs that we've identified in the consolidated plan, but it goes a step further and talks about that one-year implementation. What are we going to be doing next fiscal year to actively address those priority needs that we've identified in the consolidated plan? So the one-year resources that we anticipate receiving will be listed on page 117, and then again the annual goals, which are kind of the one-year breakdown of those larger priority goals. That section begins on page 121. And then we go even a further level describing specific projects that we will be undertaking to meet those goals and objectives. And then there's also on page 136, another very important part is our homeless needs assessment, where we discuss homelessness in Champaign County and Urbana, and how we will be partnering with other organizations to address that need and how we will be utilizing our funds and the resources we have to address the needs of individuals experiencing homelessness in our community. So with that, I'll pass it over to Nick, where he'll go into a little bit more detail about the needs assessment and market analysis of the consolidated plan.
Thanks, Braden. Good evening, everyone. So this is going to be a pretty high-level overview. As you saw, these sections of the plan are about 70 pages long, so we'll just touch on a few of the really big takeaways, but again, we do encourage everybody to dig in and read through the whole thing. So as far as what we were looking at to inform these sections, the needs assessment and the market analysis, it was a pretty wide range of things, from quantitative sources like the census, the American Community Survey. HUD puts out a report called the Comprehensive Housing and Affordability Study, which is really affordability and housing targeted data that we used a lot for the plan. In addition to that, we're using more localized data through local organization plans and reports. This is through organizations like the Housing Authority, the Continuum of Service Providers to the Homeless, the County Mental Health Board, and so on. We're also doing sit-down consultations with service providers to make sure we have an understanding of what they're seeing on the ground in real time. And then we're also connecting with folks directly in the community through a community needs survey that we distributed throughout summer and fall of last year and received almost 200 responses for. And then we also attended a variety of outreach events and have held a couple public hearings concerning the consolidated plan as well. So again, there's a lot of data in these sections and we don't have time to touch on everything. So just for the purposes of contextualizing contextualizing tonight's conversation, one of the key metrics we're looking at is cost burden and how frequently it's occurring. Cost burden is a statistic that basically means when someone is spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. It's generally recognized in household finance that beyond that point, folks tend to not have enough money left over to cover other basic needs. So in the consortium area, which I don't know if we touched on this yet, home funds are used throughout the Urbana Home Consortium area, which actually consists of the city of Urbana, the city of Champaign, and then unincorporated parts of Champaign County. So a lot of the data that we're looking at is at that geographic level. So just keep that in mind with these numbers. But so in the consortium area, based on that comprehensive housing affordability study data we have, a little over half of renters in the consortium area are cost burdened and just under a third of homeowners. And then we really do see this when we break down the data a little further, and that's all covered in the plan itself. We see it's pretty concentrated at the lowest income levels, so that would be households below 50% of the area median income, which HUD would call very low income, and then that extremely low income level, especially below 30% of the area median. This is an area where we continue to see racial disparities in the housing market, with Black households currently showing up as disproportionately experiencing cost burden. And then among homeowners, one of the things that really stands out when you break down the demographics there is that elderly households are disproportionately experiencing cost burden, and this is something that tracks with a lot of what we've been hearing from service providers, where a lot of people after retirement have fixed and reduced incomes and are struggling to keep up with housing costs. So that brings us to our service provider consultation section. This is alluded to throughout the plan. A lot of the sections throughout the needs assessment and market analysis are categorized specifically by like public housing needs, homeless needs, other special needs. So throughout those sections, we're really leaning heavily on some of those consultations we did. So just in general, one of the things we're hearing pretty consistently across the board is that existing service providers are operating at or near capacity, with many having large wait lists for services. And this is something that we're seeing particularly acutely in the area of homeless shelter and services and rental assistance resources. And then as far as what we're hearing from folks in the community, we are seeing a lot of support in the feedback we're getting for increasing affordable housing stock, both in terms of homes for ownership and rental housing, as well as a need for continued rental assistance resources. Again, consistent with what we're seeing in the data and hearing from service providers, a lot of attention on addressing senior needs, and then other high priorities that we hear a lot about are mental health services, childcare, and food security. And with that, I will hand it back to Braden.
So thank you, Nick. And again, we describe in the plan, a lot of the needs that we're seeing in the community and how we're intending to address those needs. And a huge part of that is resources, funding to support programming that addresses those needs. So this is our anticipated resources over the 5-year period for the community development block grant funding. Again, this is based on the annual allocation that you see there. This is what we're anticipating to receive this upcoming fiscal year. This is based on our allocation for the previous year that we got. That's our standard practice. We do not know our HUD allocation yet. Congress has to pass the budget first. That budget has to go to HUD. There's a very lengthy process. So as we're going through budgeting at this very early stage with the draft document, those numbers are just based on our what we're anticipating to receive. But in addition to that, we are anticipating receiving some program income. We anticipate carrying over about $500,000 in prior year resources. So for next fiscal year, we're anticipating having a little over $1 million in CDBG funding. And then you see over the remainder of the 5-year period, we're anticipating total from 2025 to 2029, receiving about $3.5 million in CDBG. Home funding, similar structure. The annual allocation that we're anticipating to receive next year is based on prior year numbers. We have a substantial prior year balance of over $3 million, which we anticipate carrying forward into fiscal year 26. And then you see the available amount, the anticipated available amount remainder over the next 5-year period at $6.4 million. Home ARP, that was the one-time allocation that we received through the American Rescue Plan Act. We have a balance of about $1.8 million. That was a one-time allocation, so we're not anticipating an annual amount. And once we spend it, it will be gone. But that's an important resource as well to address some of these issues that we've noticed in the community. So just next steps in this process. Again, this is very early stages of this planning process. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've really just started that 30-day public comment period where our focus will be on getting feedback from the community on the draft plan. That period, as I mentioned, will go through March 25th. This will not be the last year hearing from us. We will be back in April after the public comment period has ended, and once we've been able to incorporate all of that feedback into the plan, maybe we'll have our final allocations by then, who knows, but you will be seeing us again when we come back, and council will have to approve the plan before we're able to submit it to HUD. The date for submission to HUD is May 5th, and then our program year will begin on July 1 and will run through June 30th of 2026. So again, we want to hear from the community. This is really our introduction of the plan tonight. So anyone watching can access the draft document online on our website. You can also email us or call us and request a copy. We also have paper copies available for review at the City Building in the Community Development Department and at the Urbana Free Library. Before I open it up to questions, I do just want to make a note on sort of the unique time we're living in, a uniquely challenging time we're living in. As Elizabeth Hannon mentioned in her financial forecast presentation several weeks ago, this is a time of unprecedented uncertainty, and especially when it comes to federal resources. We do not know what the landscape will look like over the next 5 years. Again, we're following our normal process. This is the process we have always followed in the 50 years or so that we've had CDBG funding or home funding. We've always done this process. There's always a level of uncertainty because, again, we don't know what the allocation is going to be. It typically shifts a little bit as, different Congresses pass different budgets. So there's always some unknown, but that level of unknown this time is unprecedented. We are committed to ensuring that we utilize the resources that we have to the best of our ability to serve our community. But I just want to point out the obvious, which is that we're just not quite sure what those next 5 years will look like. We obviously will communicate to council as we hear more from HUD. We have not heard any directive or information from HUD at this point in terms of programming or changing requirements or anything like that. So we're just pursuing our normal process until we're told otherwise. But with that, I'm happy to open it up to any questions.
James.
Thank you for the presentation. You anticipated some of my questions. The one question I do want to ask is how much money do we have in our hands as far as how the allocations work?
We don't have, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. We don't have any money on hand because the way...
The 1.8 million that was like an allocation for the past, do we have that?
No, we do not. So the way that our HUD programs work is that we submit quarterly reports to HUD, and we then request reimbursement for eligible program expenses.
So it's on a reimbursement basis.
So we do it quarterly. Currently now we're doing it monthly just to ensure that we're up to date in case anything happens. But we don't have the money on hand. We also do those prior year balances that I mentioned. We don't have those on hand either. We can log into HUD's portal and see the numbers are there, but they're not in the city's bank account.
Yeah, so they're allocated or they've been stated, but
yes,
we don't have them. Okay.
We have signed grant agreements with HUD, which I hope will mean something, but you never know.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you.
We also have signed commitments with several sub-grantees for future use of these funds, which, again, we also hope will mean something.
Anyone else? Mary Alice.
Thank you. I know this is always a huge process for you guys to pull this report together. It's a very big document. So my question has to do with the new population count, because I believe that these funds are determined on the number of people, right, in our community. And now that we have updated numbers, how many fiscal years will it take for those to be reflected in our, if we keep the same mechanism for CDBG and home?
That's a good question that I wish I had an answer to. Our allocations, again, HUD is given their budget and then they apply their formula to determine how much communities receive. That formula is opaque. There's many factors that they put into their calculator to make that determination. One factor is census numbers. That is something that they look at, but they look at allocations by state. They rank a lot of different factors, and it's not fully clear. So I don't have a specific answer to that question. Hopefully, it would mean, since our numbers have gone back slightly, that could mean a small or modest increase. But it's hard to say how that will play out, especially depending on what HUD's budget looks like once Congress passes their budget.
So they have their own AI behind the scenes doing the calculations.
I think calling it AI is maybe giving it too much credit.
Okay.
But, yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Anyone else? Grace.
Thank you. Thanks again for the presentation. I'll look forward to hearing more after the public input period. I think we had talked about before, I was trying to remember what exactly was the instance, but we had some extra money from ARPA or ARPA investment interest. I don't quite remember that we put in HHI, right? Because we would have needed to amend our action plans here to do something. I'm a little fuzzy on what it was, but I just wanted to be sure that this was flexible enough to include housing needs. From what I recall, it was that we didn't have, I don't remember if it was tenant-based rental assistance or housing development and part of our plan, and just wanted to be sure that that issue was resolved if we did want to put money in those areas.
Yes, those areas are definitely identified as goals and projects that we're intending to invest these funds in. And you're correct, there was $300,000 in uncommitted ARPA that we then committed to the HHI program, along with this home ARP balance that you see there, to kind of bring those different pots of funding together. So that $300,000 ARPA is not reflected in these numbers. That was not part of our home allocation. We got that through the city's ARPA, which is kind of different. But yes, to answer your larger question, affordable housing development is certainly identified as a priority in the plan, and is something that we are intending to budget funding for over the next 5 years.
And then if I may, what was the issue why we couldn't do that with that 300,000? Was it just the amount wasn't right, or we didn't have that flagged?
I'm not quite sure what you're referring to.
From what I recall, I think there was a reason why we moved that 300,000 into HHI, because it was some limitation within these annual plans. Is that not right?
No, I think the reason we moved the funding there was because it was ARPA funding that was uncommitted, and we identified that, hey, there's a need for more affordable housing and homelessness services, and so we thought of it as a unique opportunity to kind of bring together different pots of funding to kind of offer those grants to local organizations. So that was my understanding. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question.
I think so. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, Braden, looks like you're free to go, sir. Thanks for the presentation. Next up, next up will be new business. The first is a resolution number 2025-03-018R, a resolution authorizing the execution of an intergovernmental agreement for residential electronics and household hazardous waste collection from the Public Works Department. And Mr. Scott Tess has the floor.
Can you turn on your mic?
Sorry. This is our annual intergovernmental agreement to allow the city to participate with other municipalities in the region on 2 electronics waste recycling events and 1 household hazardous waste recycling event. You'll notice that the household hazardous waste event is much cheaper than the electronics. The reason for that is the state of Illinois picks up most of the cost for the household hazardous waste. It's actually a very expensive event, but we're fortunate to have that funded local, and a local event funded by the state this year. This is overall just under a $10,000 spend. We wouldn't normally bring a $10,000 spend to city council, but state statute requires a council action for an intergovernmental agreement. So that's what's before you today. I'll take any questions you may have.
Questions? James?
Yeah, I always ask this question, Scott, so I apologize for doing it, but I do it for the public's knowledge. It's great that we do these programs, particularly the hazardous waste, but it's still true, right, that for a lot of electronics wastes, you can take them to local recyclers and don't have to wait for this event. It's like TVs and things that are like, that usually cost something to get rid of, that these really support.
You're correct. There's a lot of local recyclers, scrap metal recyclers will take a lot of different types of electronics Monday through Friday, and so folks can take those materials to those facilities. Most places don't accept TVs. It's maybe one or two that do, but they charge a fee. There's no fees charged at our 3 events. And the bulk of the electronics that we collect, where I think the memo says half of the electronics we collect these days are televisions. And so this is kind of the best opportunity to unload an old television that people are trying to get rid of. And there's really no options for household hazardous waste. We don't want chemicals going bad in people's basements and garages for, stored for years waiting to figure out what they might do with it. So we're very fortunate to have we didn't have state funding at all for several years, and then we've had state funding here locally for several years in a row, so we're very fortunate.
But we're working on that too, right, with the the funds that we put towards hopefully getting a permanent site here someday.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Anybody else with questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I will move resolution number 2025-03018R, resolution authorizing the execution of an intergovernmental agreement for residential electronics and household hazardous waste collection to the city council consent agenda.
Second.
Okay, moved by Mary Alice, seconded by Sharice. Discussion. Grace.
I don't think I have a direct conflict of interest, but I'll abstain just in case I'm involved in this event in other capacities.
Okay, anybody else for discussion? James.
I just want to reiterate, I mean, these are great programs. We've been doing it for a long time in conjunction with the county and other municipalities. It's a great option for people. It's actually kind of a social event. You see people there and drop things off, but thank you for continuing to bring this to us.
Okay, with that, we will have a voice vote to move this to the regular council meeting. Oh, yeah, is that consent? Yeah, okay, consent, under the consent agenda. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. Oh, aye. And all opposed say nay. And one abstention. Okay. So the motion does pass. That will be sent. The clerk has direction to send that to the next meeting on the consent agenda. Next item. Thank you, Scott. The next item is resolution number 2025-03-019R, a resolution certifying a community housing development organization for the Urbana Home Consortium, namely Habitat for Humanity, for the program year 2025. And I'm also going to read the next one, resolution number 2025-03-020R, a resolution approving and authorizing the execution of an Urbana Home Consortium Community Housing Development Organization funding agreement, again with Habitat for Humanity, for the program year 2025. And Braden, you have the floor, sir.
Okay, thank you. So the next two resolutions go together. I'll talk about them at once, and then if there's any questions about either of them, I'm happy to answer those. So the first resolution is to certify Habitat for Humanity as a community housing development organization for the Urbana Home Consortium, and then the second resolution approves a funding agreement with Habitat for the development of affordable housing through the Home Consortium's CHODO funding program. This is another annual process that we go through, so hopefully you're familiar with this, but this is one of the important ways that we provide funding to local organizations to develop affordable housing. So just to provide some context, a CHODO is a private nonprofit community-based organization that has staff with the capacity to develop affordable housing for the community that it serves. It's a HUD term, so that's why it's an acronym. They love acronyms. There's a certification process that staff must undertake each year in order to determine whether or not an organization qualifies as a CHODO and is therefore eligible to receive CHODO funding. We have to look at a variety of factors, including the legal status of the organization, the organizational structure, and then their capacity and experience with developing affordable housing. So again, those are the criteria that we look at, and then if they are eligible under those criteria, we're able to recommend certification as a community housing development organization. So for nonprofits that are certified as CHODOs, the Home Consortium must set aside a minimum of 15% of our annual home allocation for affordable housing projects specifically undertaken by CHODOs. HUD also requires that we set aside a maximum of 5% of our allocation to be used to support CHODO operating expenses, so payroll and then other costs associated with the development of affordable housing. As the lead entity of the Urbana Home Consortium, Urbana staff are responsible for accepting and reviewing proposals for CHODO certification and for providing funding recommendations for CHODO projects. So based on staff's assessment of the proposals received this cycle, Habitat for Humanity meets the certification criteria and is thus eligible to receive home funds for affordable housing development in the upcoming fiscal year 2026. So attachment 1 in the memo includes the project summary. There's also a brief narrative and timeline of the 4 affordable housing projects that Habitat intends to undertake with this funding. For the upcoming fiscal year 2026, they have requested $150,000 in project development support, so that's direct construction costs for constructing the houses, and then $26,000 in operating support, which again will help support their staff in the construction of 4 affordable housing units for home ownership. 1 of the projects will take place in Urbana, and 3 of the projects will take place in Champaign. And again, they will provide affordable housing for local low-income families. So approval of these resolutions further the affordable housing goals that we have described in our current 2020 through 2024 consolidated plan, and also further Mayor Council Strategic Goal 2.2B, partner with developers to generate affordable rental and homeowner housing. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions.
Anybody with questions? Grace.
Thanks again for this. I think this is really great and important thing for our community. I just wanted to ask, because at least the past year or two, we had 2 CHODO partners, and I was wondering if it's possible to still add the second one if they are available partway through the year.
Yeah, so I'll answer that. So for the past 2 years, First Followers also received CHODO certification and received CHODO funds. They did submit a proposal for this cycle, and then based on staff's determination, they did not meet the criteria to certify for CHODO status this year, which was why we are not recommending them for funding. Again, we have to look at a variety of factors, and that's determined by HUD, the criteria that we have to look at. As I mentioned, capacity, experience, various things like that, and based on those criteria, we determined that they were ineligible this year. But I'm very proud of our partnership with them, and I'm working diligently with their leadership to ensure that next year, for the next cycle, they will be up and running and able to receive certification as a CHOTO.
Okay, so they are out for the whole
That's correct.
program
Yeah, for
year.
this cycle, yes.
Okay, and is that just because of the funding, or there is no way to mend it partway through? I guess I'm just wondering if that's more of a choice or a necessity as far as like what we're allowed to change or not.
That's how the process is set up. It's a yearly kind of process where they submit proposals, they get certification. That's how HUD outlines the process. So for this, and we have to describe that in our annual action plan. So kind of the rules of how that process goes is described. And we have to be held to that. So for this year, we are unable to provide them funding. But like I said, I'm very optimistic that we can get them to a level where next year they're able to receive funding again.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else for questions? Okay, I'll entertain a motion.
Can we
Go ahead, Sharice.
combine, because they're not combined on the, can we make that an omnibus?
Point of order, it's not worth it because it takes two actions to put them
Okay,
together.
all right. I didn't know
Do it.
I
There's
didn't know
only
which
two of
would
them.
be more
We should just do each of
efficient.
them. You have to take an action to put them together and then vote on it. So
Okay.
it's two actions anyway.
Okay. Well, we won't. I'd make a motion then to, for resolution number 2025-03-019R. The right one?
Yep.
A resolution certifying a community housing development organization for the Urbana Home Consortium Habitat for Humanity, PY 2025.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. I was going to ask if it'd be on consent.
Do I do both of them?
Well, let's back up. Do you want to put it on the consent agenda?
Yeah, on the consent agenda.
Okay. Are you seconding that? Okay. Moved by Sharice, seconded by James. Discussion. Jaya.
I just wanted to quickly say I appreciate Grace's question and I appreciate Braden's answer. I think it's worth noting how remarkable it is that we have city staff who are willing to work with our community agencies to make sure that we're allocating our funds the best possible way. That's not support that a lot of nonprofits get, and so I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to Braden and the other members of the community development team.
Anybody else for discussion? Okay. This again will be a voice vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed say nay. The ayes have it. That resolution will be moved to the next meeting.
Okay, I'd like to do the next one.
Go ahead, Sharice.
Resolution number 2025-03-020R. Resolution approving and authorizing the execution of Urbana Home Consortium Community Housing Development Organization Funding Agreement, Habitat for Humanity, PY 2025, to consent agenda as well for approval.
Second.
Okay, moved by Sharice for the consent agenda, seconded by Mary Alice. Discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. Those two resolutions move forward to the next meeting. Thank you, Braden. Next item. Ordinance number 2025-03-007, an ordinance amending the annual budget ordinance, budget amendment number 6 omnibus, and it looks like our stellar Elizabeth Hannon is getting in position to take the floor. You have it, ma'am.
Thank you. So this is our 6th budget amendment this year. And as you know, budget amendments do require 6 affirmative votes. So I will just quickly run through the items that are included here. First of all, we are going to reallocate funds from a vacant position in the legal area in order to pay for outside counsel services. As you know, we've done this several times in the past. Then there is a group of line items related to scheduled small equipment. And these are essentially revolving accounts where we budget a level amount on an annual basis to replace certain pieces of equipment in each department. But because the purchases don't happen in a level manner, we roll those over, whatever's left after the end of the year. The largest item here is $330,000 for overtime in fire operations. This is largely driven by employees being out related to duty injuries and also military leave. And as you know, when they get down to a certain minimum number of people on a shift, they have no choice but to call people back on overtime. We are moving $20,000 from the Public Works operating budget into the VERF, so there's a transfer between funds of $20,000. And related to that, we're also rolling forward funds for that chipper truck purchase. So we're rolling it forward from prior fiscal year. We're also increasing the amount. There is, and we will talk about the bonds here in just a minute, but we're adding another $15,000 for professional fees related to issuance of bonds for the fire stations. We are moving money between projects in the local motor fuel tax fund to help pay for a portion of the Philo Road resurfacing. And let's see, an increase in funds for Boneyard Creek maintenance. And then in the IT fund, there's a small reallocation from savings from vacancies in order to fund a new IT ticketing system, which they would like to implement this year. So happy to answer questions.
Questions? James?
It's always the smallest things that get the questions. So I do want to ask a question about, I'm not concerned about the cost of the ticket system, but the implication in the description of it is that we are buying a new system because we didn't want to go to a cloud system. And I'm curious if that's you may not be able to answer this question, but I'm curious if there's a philosophy that we would prefer to run things ourselves on our own equipment instead of use the cloud, because there's an implication of long-term hardware that has to be kept running to support a ticket system we run ourselves.
I will get you a better answer. I'm going to say I don't think that's our general philosophy at the city. Our entire financial system, the whole open Gov system that we use for many things in Public Works, those are in the cloud. So it's not a general philosophy.
It just feels like an opportunity that's being missed to get rid of more hardware that we don't need to run anymore.
Yeah, there's some specific reason, and I will find the reason and get you that information.
Grace?
I had a question for fire department leadership. Just if you had a sense or could give us some kind of, Chief Dade back there too, yes. Some context into the overtime and how long you might think this would last, just that this is almost double the overtime. And from what I recall, the budget talk with, I think we continued the 6 safer positions. And I guess just wondering if you have a sense on how much longer this overtime need might continue.
We do. Thank you. Good evening. So I'm glad you brought up SAFER, because SAFER is actually a couple things that were involved with this. We are grateful that we do have the SAFER. They're incredibly helpful to us. But starting in September, we did have a influx in hiring. So we did hire 7 in September, and part of that was getting them their initial training. So right off of that, we had 10 people that were going to their initial training because of a few retirement separations. Currently, we have one that just returned from injury, so they're back on operations. We still have 4 off on injury and 1 deployed. Our deployed members should be returning June 1st. We should also have, or we're expecting, one of the injuries to return at the beginning of June, and then 1 in July. 2 of them are still undetermined right now.
And I'm sorry, to clarify, that includes 7 people who are new hires in training, or they are currently working, or they're in training still?
Correct. When we hired them in September, that was part of the early cause of some of the overtime, is because we have to send them off for training. Their initial training right off of the bat is 10 weeks. After that, they start to come back, get on the job training, and then they go on to shift. So we incurred a little bit because of that large number of hires right off of the fiscal year.
Thank you.
Anybody else with questions? I'll go ahead, Mary Alice.
Yeah, so just expanding a little bit on the purchase of the ticket system. Everybody loves ticket systems. So I'm just trying to understand. So basically, when they researched the different ticketing systems, there was a cloud option, and then there was a kind of install a program option, so to speak. And it says, while the new system's annual maintenance costs are slightly lower, the one-time purchase is $7,800. So I'm assuming what that means is that from what we're currently doing right now, the reason I asked this question is because we're taking money from a vacancy to pay the $7,800, and I want to ensure that if that position is needed next year, we'll have the funding for that.
Correct. The $7,800 is a one-time cost related to purchase and implementation, but they will have that position fully budgeted next year, and they will have sufficient money in their operating budget to cover the ongoing costs.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I will entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion. I'm not going to put it on the consent agenda because it needs 6 votes. I will move ordinance number 2025-03007, an ordinance amending the annual budget ordinance, Budget Amendment 6 Omnibus, to City Council with a recommendation for approval.
Second.
Moved by Mary Alice, seconded by Sharice. Any discussion? Okay, because of the nature of this being a budget amendment, I'm going to ask for a roll call. Clerk?
Councilmember Wu?
Yes.
Councilmember Evans?
Yes.
Councilmember Hersey?
Yes.
Councilmember Colasetti?
Yes.
Councilmember Wilkin?
Yes.
Councilmember Quisenberry?
Yes.
Okay, that does meet passage to be moved to the regular agenda next week. Next item is ordinance number 2025-03-008, an ordinance providing for the issuance of not to exceed $9 million general obligation bonds, Series 2025. And go ahead, Elizabeth, when you're ready.
Sure. So this is the ordinance that would give us the authority to issue $9 million in bonds for the fire station projects. And this is consistent with what's in the budget and what's in the capital improvement plan. You've talked about this previously back in you've talked about the fire station project many times, but you specifically in 2023 approved a resolution indicating that it was our intent to reimburse some of the construction expense by issuing bonds. And that was a necessary legal step in this process because of the timing. So staff has been working with Chapman, a Chicago law firm, as bond counsel on this, and with Baird as placement agent for this bond issue. Bond counsel makes sure we're doing everything by the book, and they can issue an opinion on the tax-exempt status of the bonds. The placement agent markets the city bonds to financial institutions that will purchase them. I also want to point out that we're currently going through essentially a pre-qualification process to make sure that everyone who would bid on the bonds is certified under our requirements in Section 2-119 of the City Code, which we call our EEO certification process. And that section does require that financial institutions that the city works with be certified. So currently, based on the information that I have and the timeline for certification, which has basically closed for the March meeting, I expect that we will probably have 4 or fewer bidders for our bonds. Also to note, in next year's budget, we'll be doing some housekeeping items related to this. For example, we'll have to create a debt service fund, which the city has never done previously for other bond issues. Not quite sure why, because I wasn't here when we issued those other bonds. but there will be some additional steps. So we expect, several of the bidders are already certified because they've done business with the city in the past. We expect that any additional financial institutions that want to bid will be certified on March 18th when the Human Rights Commission meets. Baird will distribute a preliminary term sheet on March 24th. Then there will be a period of due diligence. So if any of the potential investors have questions for the city about our financial condition, we'll probably have some meetings to talk about that. They may have questions about, our annual financial report, our financial policies, general things like that. And I would be participating in that. And then April 19th, we'll ask for best and final offers to do the financing for the city. And then on the 14th, I would expect to notify you of the outcome. And then by the 29th, we should be closed on the bonds. The money should be in our bank account. So this ordinance basically sets the parameters, which is maximum $9 million, maximum interest rate of 5.5%. I don't expect it will be that high, but we don't know what may happen between now and then. And then it gives that authority to me and the mayor to pull the trigger on it, because this is a very time-sensitive process. The markets are moving all the time. Interest rates are changing. We need to be able to lock that in fairly quickly.
Any questions? Grace.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm trying to organize some thoughts here. I feel like it's a lot to take in as far as the financials. I was wondering about Section 10 talks about tax levy abatement, and it sounds like we're promising that we will abate taxes sufficient to cover $1.25 million a year from 2025 to 2033. And I'm wondering, is that already included in our financial forecast, or are we saying that we would need to increase our tax levy by that amount?
So the tax levy will not be increased. This is a common thing. So cities generally receive a lower interest rate on general obligation bonds, and general obligation bonds are backed by the full faith and credit of the city or the city's taxing authority. So typically what happens, and this happened exactly the same way with our last two bond issues, there's a levy established when the bonds are issued, and that information is provided to the county clerk, and that instructs them to levy those taxes to pay the debt service on the bonds. And then each year when we levy taxes, we pass a resolution or an ordinance that says, okay, but no, don't levy those taxes because we have the money to make those bond payments. So the intention is that we're never going to levy taxes to pay these bonds. There is, in the capital improvement plan, you will see the amounts set aside to pay the debt service on the bonds. But it's just, it's kind of a quirky thing that because they're general obligation bonds, that levy has to be established in the ordinance.
Thank you. And we won't get to have an approval on the final bond company, is that right?
Correct. What we're asking you to do is approve this now. Now, anybody that would bid on our bonds will be certified by the Human Rights Commission, but you would not. The decision would be made among those certified financial institutions. The decision would be made based on the most advantageous arrangement for the city, so basically lowest cost.
Okay, and you said that they would be required to be an equal opportunity employer, right?
Well, they would be required to be certified by our Human Rights Commission, which we generally refer to as the EEO certification process.
Okay, thank you.
James.
Yeah, I was just going to add, it's more than a quirky thing. It's to make sure that we can pay this debt no matter what else happens with finances with the city. But we've planned and we have money to pay it, so we will have to go through a process. I assume it's every year to say, we don't need you to, city authority or county authority, you don't need to collect these taxes because we're going to make the payment.
Yeah, that process will look a little bit different in the future because, as I understand it, the bond council has written this so that we now have the staff to do that abatement annually without coming back to the city council. That's all embedded here in the ordinance. We'll still be abating the tax levy every year to maintain our tax rate, though.
Mary Alice.
I just want to make sure that I believe this is what this is saying to us, right? We are basically delegating to you and the mayor the ability to issue bonds as long as it doesn't exceed the 5.564 years and the amount of the interest, right? So if anything's lower, you can do it, but you can't go above it.
Right. It actually allows us to go to 10 years on the bonds. I think that was kind
Okay.
of like an average duration of the bonds or something like that.
But
But
so
yes,
up to 10
we
years
can't
at
go
a certain interest rate. I'm just trying to clarify
up
for
to
everybody.
10 years, not more than $9 million, and not more than 5.5% interest.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, seeing none, do I have a motion? James?
Yeah, I'll move ordinance number 2025-03-008, an ordinance providing for the issuance of not to exceed $9 million general obligation bonds, Series 2025, to City Council for approval.
Second.
Moved by James, seconded by Mary Alice. Discussion. Seeing none, will the clerk please call roll?
Councilmember Wu?
Yes.
Councilmember Evans?
No.
Councilmember Hersey? Yes. Councilmember Colasetti?
Yes.
Councilmember Wilkin?
Yes.
Councilmember Quisenberry?
Yes.
That motion passes, will be sent to the next council meeting for approval on the regular agenda, I believe. Okay. Next up, old business, ordinance number 2024-12-042, an ordinance establishing approval policy and reporting requirements for policing, surveillance, technology, and databases. And the mayor would like to make some opening remarks. Diane, you have the floor.
More to ask for clarification. Just so folks know, it is our intent to get an ordinance formatted, reviewed, and brought to council for consideration and passage. So I think we're all on the same page there. Where we're at now, though, is we have had 5 versions of this ordinance sent to council since December. Just to make sure everyone remembers, last Monday, the council discussed version 4 of the surveillance ordinance, and during that discussion, one of the major things you clarified through a straw poll was that the scope of the ordinance would focus on police surveillance and police surveillance technology and investigative technology, and you discussed some other issues. So following last Monday's meeting, the city attorney worked to format version 4 of the ordinance that you had in front of you so that it could be incorporated into city code. There were some changes that had to be made. He also included language that was suggested by Councilmember Mary Alice Wu. He incorporated language that reflected the direction you gave from your straw poll into that ordinance. And I believe he also had another phone conversation with Councilmember Wilkin about the ordinance. So city staff, once all that was done, that is the version, the updated version of the ordinance that city staff was going to work on to get it into, to get city staff review and comments so that we could get something back to you for consideration. Well, a couple of days later, a 5th version of the ordinance was sent out to council and was put into this week's packet. This version 5 does not reflect the direction from the straw poll of last week, in that the scope of the ordinance still has been shifted back to include all city departments. It contains brand new language related to exigent circumstances, and I don't have it all in front of me, but as I recall it, it narrows the definition of exigent circumstances and limits the extension of the anyway, there's brand new language related to exigent circumstances that wasn't in version 4, and there's some other changes as well. So what our request to council is, which version do you want staff to work on? What is your intent? And do you want us to continue working on version 4, or is now version 5 the one that you are wanting staff to format and review.
Okay, question on the floor. Who wants to answer first? Or Mary Alice?
Hi, so I think we've had some great conversation here at City Council in terms of what kind of the intent is. Of course, the devil's in the details in terms of how we explicitly say things. And I was really kind of holding back on doing any kind of suggested language and so forth until I felt like we were kind of going in the same direction. So last week, I went through and started doing some edits. Specifically, I was trying to do things that were operationalizing it. So how would we as a city be able to meet this? Like, what would we do? For example, I think in the original one it said that with written consent, and I replaced it with majority vote of, with a resolution or something like that. So I kind of was going through it with the eye towards how would we actually implement this. The second thing that I did was I was looking at, based on the conversation that we had last time, making it so that we were talking about police surveillance since we had that straw poll vote. And then the third thing I did was try and disentangle a little bit the databases and the surveillance technology because I was getting tripped up a little bit in it. And so I was kind of doing it in parallel where I would have police surveillance technology, yada, yada, yada. And then I talked about surveillance databases that UPD manages that includes personally identifying information. I think at the end of the day, what I'm hearing from many people is that people are concerned about how their personal data is getting stored, who has access to it, are we selling it? And of course, aside from the fact that we can have multiple indicators to identify somebody, if we put that aside for a moment, adding in personal identifying information into databases is a big deal if it's something that's just out there in the world. And we actually had somebody email City Council today, I think, talking about surveillance databases and being concerned that it didn't seem clear, based on the conversation last time, that ALPR data was surveillance database. And I think that's actually, in my opinion, the perfect example of a technology that is out there and deployed within the community that is just gathering data. It's not gathering data for a purpose of a crime that's been committed. It's just sitting there gathering data. That to me is a perfect representation of something that this ordinance would cover. So with that in mind, I sent that, and then Grace said that she was working on something, and I feel like at this time it would be good because I don't want to have multiple people working on different versions and it all getting tangled up and it's not clear in terms of what direction we're going. So I just want to kind of let you know what I was working on, and then I kind of stopped because I know Grace had a new version. I agree, it would be nice. I would like to be able to continue suggesting different edits to City Council, but it would be really good to know which version we're working off of.
Grace.
Thank you. I also had prepared some kind of opening for presenting the ordinance for the item tonight, if there's a time for that. And as far as some of the specific questions that were brought up, I did not incorporate the change from last week's discussion, since that was a discussion and not a binding decision. So I would like to call the question again tonight about applying to all departments or the police department, and am hoping for a different outcome and would like to make some of my opening statements before that point. I haven't seen any of the recommended changes from you, Mary Alice. I know we talked and I understood some, but I haven't seen any of the changes or recommendations from the Mary Alice and City Attorney version, so I don't really have anything I can say on that. It would be great if it could be shared so that we could say something. There have been a handful of versions because this has been a collaborative process that has been happening for the past 10 weeks and has been open to input. The changes that have happened have been largely minor changes taken from recommendations from our discussions at an item of business at our meetings. The definitions did change earlier on. That was one of the more major changes, and I think that it'd still be good to clarify that. So again, I have some things to say opening, and I think it would be helpful if we did maybe even go through the ordinance and be sure that we're all on the same page as far as what it means and what applies.
Okay. Grace, are you wanting to make a motion on whether it's all departments or just police department first, or do you want to have the discussion regarding going through the ordinance?
I would like to say some things as far as the presentation of the ordinance, and I would like to eventually tonight call the question for a straw poll, since this is an item of business tonight.
Why don't you go
about how it
ahead and
applies.
make your opening remarks then?
Thank you. So I did want to just have a reminder that I appreciate people have echoed tonight in public input that the proposed drafts have had review from an attorney and CPRB member, ACLU of the state of Illinois and Champaign County, other community experts and activists, and then in more recent drafts with our city attorney as well. I've shared each draft with council members and city leadership for the past 10 weeks, and I would appreciate it if others would please read what's proposed and do some research on which to base some recommendations and questions. One of the additions was in the definitions for this week was language from the Oak Park, Illinois, which has a similar ordinance, and some of their language about state exemptions for body-worn cameras. It was not hard to find. One Google search was able to find this, even though apparently it wasn't found in some other research. I think Urbana being a trailblazer is important, so we would not be the first in the state of Illinois to pass such an ordinance, but we would be one of the firsts, just like our human rights ordinance, that historically we haven't been afraid to be 50 years ahead of the state when it comes to protecting our residents. And I think that this is a very similar example, that just because some things may be covered at a state level, we can still be more specific. And I think the great thing about Urbana is that we have done that in the past. I also want to keep in mind this important point that this ordinance is not to designate or dictate the use of any specific technology. That's been the intent from the beginning, that this would simply decide, lay out the policy and the procedures for how we use these things, and that any specific use would be defined in the use policy. I think that a problem with trying to piece out investigative use is that that would be in the use policy. That seems like the whole reason why we have surveillance technology. We mass surveil everyone in the chance that we use it for an investigation when we need to go back and look at something. So I think that that absolutely has a place in the use policy and not so much in the ordinance. I think this needs to apply to surveillance technology, which is what's currently written. And what's proposed is very similar to other ordinances that have been passed. I also recently found an ACLU model ordinance, which the content is very similar. Again, this is researched. This is very similar in its main content to other ordinances like this that have been passed. The surveillance technology in general is evolving a lot faster than our societal knowledge and the regulations, and this ordinance is about transparency and democratic checks and balances. I think that most people want to know that they're being tracked in their movements all over town and didn't know this until some of the recent conversations the past few weeks. And I imagine that a lot of our use policies for the police department would closely mirror state and federal laws, that there are already some laws in place about how law enforcement uses surveillance and location tracking technology. However, from some of my understandings, that those regulations do not apply to non-law enforcement, meaning that other departments do not have those same regulations. And so to me, that seems to be a reason to be even more justification to apply to all city departments. Because again, law enforcement already have some of these regulations, so I think our use policy would largely be redundant for the police department. But to my understanding, parking enforcement and economic development and others that may be using surveillance technology don't already have those protections in place. So I think it would be even more important to have those where they don't already exist. I think it's important to protect our residents and visitors and the city and its staff, that there are multiple lawsuits around the country over the use of surveillance technology by cities. And I think it's prudent and responsible of the city to have reporting and policies on the use of surveillance technology. And the way I see it, this is not a personal attack or saying that we think these technologies are or will be misused. It's simply establishing safeguards to ensure that these tools are used responsibly and transparently. There are examples of malfunctioning, circumventing, misusing of surveillance technology, and they highlight the reasonable concerns and the understandable desire for policies and reporting. This ordinance is pretty dense. It's 12 pages with the definitions, but it's pretty dense. And there are some new things that I know I've learned a lot about some of these technologies that I didn't before this process. And again, I'd be happy to go through maybe the ordinance together on the screen and be sure that we're on the same page and address any other questions.
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to respond right away? I want to also alert Deputy Chief Spicer and Attorney Rochley to be on standby to answer questions, if you would, gentlemen. But who's next? Who wants to talk? Go ahead, Jaya.
Yeah, I would just say in terms of which draft, I would go with the most recent draft that Grace submitted to all of us. And I say that because over this whole process, I think that this council owes Grace a lot. That this is not a small task. And I've seen every iteration take into consideration the conversations that have been had in these chambers as well as from our residents. I think that everything that's been presented to us from Grace has been well researched and backed up and responsive to those conversations. So I believe that the current draft is the most appropriate one to look at. And I do think it is important that we get that clarity. So if there are other edits that people want to work on, that we're establishing a process so that we don't end up with unnecessary additional drafts of this ordinance and we can actually move it forward. But I think each version that I've seen that Grace has provided to the council has simply been responding to questions and comments that have come up in these chambers.
Go ahead, Mary Alice.
So, we had it was a discussion item last time, and I am worried if we're going to take direction tonight that Chandra isn't here, and she was part of that conversation that we had last time. So I would be hesitant to take the only way to do it is a straw poll, unless the clerk tells me something else.
You are correct. If you are to make changes, you can do a straw poll. You can also make amendments. I will also remind the council that we do not currently have a motion on the floor. And while this is a council-initiated item, so it is, traditional that they give the presentation, right now we can really only ask questions because there is no motion on the floor to allow for discussion or deliberation.
Grace.
I would make a motion so I'm going to move it to the regular agenda for council. But if we come to some time, I am willing to do a friendly amendment to keep in cow, and I think that's procedurally okay. Okay, so I will move that we move this to City Council regular agenda, ordinance number 2024-12-042, an ordinance establishing approval, policy, and reporting requirements for police surveillance technology and databases.
Second.
Moved by Grace, seconded by Jaya. We are now in discussion then. James, go ahead.
So when we had our discussion 2 weeks ago, I think I had committed to trying to recraft, I had some concerns about Section 3, and I committed to rework that such that I felt it was saying the same thing in intent, but not in the way that I had concerns with. I did get that done. Unfortunately, it was on Thursday. I shared it with Grace. It was too late for it to be included. I would like to add it to any edit that is done in the future. It basically changes the content of 3 to describing the criteria that future councils should look at when reviewing decisions, and did it more in a bullet format. Thank you, Grace. I think I had mentioned before that I felt the section before was kind of declarative. It was a shall statement as opposed to this kind of statement, and it also presents each of the options as things that can be weighed without implying that some options might be more important than others, because in some cases some may be more important than others, but in a particular case we don't know. So I would like to see this added to the language if people feel it is still in the spirit of what was there before. it does meet what I was looking for. The other thing I would add is I would like to have the benefit of what Mary Alice worked on with regard to untangling the conversation about data and databases, because that's something that had been tripping me up, and I think I had suggested, trying to separate the two. I think the other thing that's on my mind is personally identifiable information is a bigger concern in some ways for all of us with regard to how organizations manage that and protect that, and that's regardless of whether it's acquired via surveillance or otherwise. Some of the things we collect are shared in public databases, such as if you apply for a permit to do something, we take your personal information and it's out there. But other reasons we collect information that somebody might not consider surveillance, we need to have modern approaches to make sure that we take care of that, that we're stewards of that. So what does that mean? Why am I saying that? Well, I think maybe, I'm not trying to put words in Mary Alice's statement, but I think that question of personally identifiable information is something else we need to consider, which may not be directly tied down to this surveillance discussion, because it is something that's beyond that.
Mary Alice.
I would like to see, I would like to, and I'm happy to share my what my proposed edits were. I actually contacted Met because I didn't know, legally what we do with, like, do we have a resolution to approve this? Like, what is that process? So that's why I was contacting Matt to figure out what that legal process was. So I would like to disentangle those two items within this report. I would like to see this start with police technology, police surveillance technology specifically. That's what Oak Park does. They talk about police surveillance technology. And I would like for us to think about like what is within our realm of power, I guess is the best word to say it. I mean, I understand people's concern about tracking cell phones throughout the United States in Urbana, Champaign County, Illinois, and so forth, but frankly, we don't have the ability to stop them from gathering that data. So when I was looking at it, I was like, well, what do we have the power to do? We, as a city, have to say we are or we are not collecting certain kinds of data, but beyond the city, they unfortunately can collect data on us unless you turn off the location services, unless you happen to be in GDPR and tell them to erase you from their records, the right to be forgotten. So I was trying to focus it on, like, what do we have within our control of the city? And that's what I was looking at. And I'm happy to share that information that I started crafting. It's not final by any stretch of the imagination, but I would like to see at least some of that considered before we move this on to City Council.
Diane.
And again, it needs to be put into a format for city code, and this draft is not. So when all the changes from the council are done, they need to be sent to the city attorney to be put into the proper format. And we still need to know the scope of the ordinance.
Grace.
I was just going to ask if it's okay with the chair and any objections from council if we do just pull up and go through maybe the definitions, just kind of breeze through if there's any particular misunderstandings or recommendations.
Go ahead, Grace.
I haven't talked on this mic before, I don't think. So this is a version 6. I hope that isn't grounds to be confused on the entire thing. we could start with some definitions, which in a lot of things the definitions go first. I just pulled them out separately so they didn't get too overwhelming at the beginning of the ordinance. So exigent circumstances, we already talked about this in the version 4. Oh no, did I kick something? I think I kicked a cord under here, I'm sorry, Burima, or if there's others back there. But I can verbally continue. Exigent circumstances, the only thing that we've changed was how we define that in our city code already. So chapter 6 of our city code already defines those exigent circumstances. So this just clarifies that. There's just a few words added on surveillance data definition.
Grace, can you hold up, Mary Else?
So I appreciate the reference to the city code that we already have in place, but I'm wanting to know from the police department if those types of, if that covers everything in exigent circumstances. We would have to pull up chapter 6 on the city code. And the reason I say that is because there could be, depending on how we end up defining things, I'm thinking of one of the things that you changed was not only that we purchase, but also use. So one of the big changes is if the police department uses anything, even if it's not owned by us, right? And so what I'm thinking about is, and we had this conversation about drones, right? Like the city doesn't own any drones, but we borrowed a drone from the University of Illinois to do an aerial of the car accident that happened on University. Would that be covered under your?
So I think the ordinance from the original versions have always included the use or acquisition of surveillance technology. Our current definitions do not include drones that aren't equipped with biometric software like facial recognition. So under the current definitions, a drone without facial recognition or any other biometrics does not fall under the purview of this ordinance as written. So this is the definitions of surveillance technology, things that are personally identifiable to a specific person or group, and we have an example of 20 different things that would be included. And we have I'll scroll slowly, also a long list of things that are not included. So this is, again, not including routine office stuff, parking ticket databases, other cameras. This one with the numbered number is from the language from the Oak Park Ordinance exempting body-worn cameras pursuant to Illinois state law. Also, it says for things like, internally monitoring if we have cameras on city-owned property, or we have surveillance on our own internal things for employee accountability, that those things are already exempt in the language. The definition of surveillance database, since this second version of definitions that's been the same for a couple months, surveillance data means data captured, detected, recorded, processed, intercepted, analyzed by surveillance technology. So that is a surveillance data. The original definitions were more broad and said any personally identifiable database, and I think that we quickly realized that there were some problems with that. And so since the second revision of definitions, this has been the definition of surveillance data that's generated by surveillance technology. We also define in these definitions what would be in the use report. So the use report would come when seeking approval for the use of surveillance technology. It would include the things listed here, basic information about it, and how civil liberties and rights would be potentially impacted and protected. It's also the use policy, which would be approved along with the approval of the use of each technology, which would lay out the purposes for it and its allowable uses. This does also talk about data sharing, data retention, and I think also about how we would ensure any entity sharing access to our data also complies with our requirements of our use policy. So I think that was brought up that we don't control other people use it. I think as laid out, it would include some mechanisms to uphold other users to our use policies. And then the last major piece defined here is the annual report for each technology, which includes some things about a summary on how it was used, the cost, how often our data was shared, and any complaints or concerns that were received about it. Justification for its continued use and results of any internal audits or violations of the policy. So those are the definitions. And
so Grace, I
yes.
do have a question
Yes.
about definitions, because when we discussed this previously, I had pointed out that item number 7 in the example list, gunshot detection and location hardware and services, that does not identify a person or a group. So I had said I don't know that that fits into the definition that we're talking about. The other item that I had pointed out was item 15, passive scanners of radio networks. I do not know how that fits into the definition at the top, which says used to identify individual or groups. So I had asked for those to be removed, but they're still in there.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I must have missed those. I see the point that they are not necessarily personally identifiable, so I don't know if, in our process here, if we want to straw poll things or move with different amended versions for our next COW.
Go ahead, Mary Alice.
Grace, I'm sorry that I'm so stuck on this, but if you go back to the surveillance technology, the main definition, if you scroll up, okay. Device, hardware, software that is capable of collecting, capturing, recording, retaining, processing, incepting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If I read that definition, that's a drone. So I guess my question to you is what am I missing here?
I think about being...
Because you're collecting, capturing, recording, and it says, or similar information with any identifiable. So if you have a drone going over university, we'll just use the example I was using, right? If you use a drone to go in and record what's going on university, is that surveillance technology?
I think as defined, I would interpret that it doesn't, based on, I think what I'm seeing here is that or similar information specifically associated with or capable of being associated with an identifiable group or individual. And I guess I'm just not understanding how the drone is identifiable unless it's using facial recognition or gait recognition software.
But it's capturing and collecting information. It could be collecting an identifiable information if it collects not a driver's license, sorry, a license plate.
I think so. I think it's maybe that clarification of then with the difference with license plate readers is you take a picture of the license plate and then run who does that belong to. It goes into that database. I think for me just that's the information specifically associated with.
And so that's why I'm like trying to get at the exigent circumstances and this definition, right? Because that was specifically trying to look for what happened at that crash site, and I don't know all the details about it, but I just know it was used for that purpose. And that would be to identify a specific car, right, that they were looking at. And maybe Dave can help me here a little bit, try to tie these two things together.
Yeah, so your question is what would have been gathered by that information? So it would have been used for an aerial, basically a bird's eye view of the crash scene.
Okay, so you're not collecting any identifiable information?
Well, it depends on how you interpret identifiable information. It would have, say, it's just any crash scene, not that specific one. It could have collected identifiable information in the sense that it was a red 4-door sedan, or like you mentioned, maybe it's identifiable in the sense that there's a license plate that's viewed from the vehicle. It's identifiable in the sense when you put it together with other information, like when you're on the scene doing the investigation and you get vehicle 1, vehicle 2, and the license plate on this vehicle, and I know who was driving it, and the license plate on this vehicle, and I know who was driving it, and then using the information that you're gathering from a drone, you put that together and it becomes identifiable information. So the line becomes very blurred, I think, as what.
But and that goes to the idea of an investigation, right? A very specific targeted thing that we were using it for. So this is why I'm getting muddied with some of the definitions, Grace, is trying to mesh all of these different pieces together. So unless a technology is associated with identifiable individual or group, it does not fall into this definition. That's what I'm hearing you say. Is that correct?
That's what I think from the reading of this. Always happy to hear if Matt Rushley or other legal experts, this is what I would interpret based on how it's written.
Go ahead, Carol.
We, several of us have been sort of puzzling through this and more raising questions so far than for ourselves than actually putting a final copy that we would like to offer back. But I think, Mary Alice, this is getting at one area that is confusing, to say the least. So the drone conversation is a good one, and honing in on this idea of being able to identify people. So then if we look at something else in the list and try to equate it, and you look at the closed circuit television cameras, and so is it a closed circuit television camera, or is it a closed circuit television camera that's equipped with facial recognition? Because you could be capturing images that someone could then look at and go, I know that person. Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of things that are, I would say, embedded in this that are, when you start to tease it out, it becomes confusing to staff who would be held accountable for complying with this. So can you offer some clarification?
Oh, Jaya.
Yeah, thank you. So I have to say, I think the definitions are pretty clear, and that would mean that drones would not fall under this policy. I don't necessarily agree with that, right? Like, I think if we want to expand it to make it clear that there's a situation where this policy would apply to drones, I'm definitely open to that. But I want to come back to a piece that Grace keeps trying to direct people to, is this is just the overarching, when do we need to have a policy, right? This is the ordinance saying we value transparency, we value making sure that residents understand how we're using technology, and then for each technology, there's an actual policy that's saying this is how we use this policy that has been approved by City Council. So we're not going to get the granularity for some of the examples that are listed here if they came to council and council said, yep, we are now good with ALPRs, then there would be a policy that said, this is how we are going to use them. So I think it's important to recognize this is the overarching framework. And if people feel like this is not broad enough, then we can have that conversation. You know, if it feels like there are things that are getting missed by the fact that we've been narrowing down and narrowing down and narrowing down these definitions, then we can consider expanding things back out. But there's a reason why those things don't feel like they're fully fleshed out here, because this is not the place, right, to be fleshing out the exact uses policy for each of these items, because, you know, as the police department keeps bringing up, we don't even have a lot of this stuff, right? Why are we creating policies for things that we don't have? This is creating a process so that if we're looking at a technology, we can say, here's when we need to create a policy and what needs to be in that policy.
Carol.
Totally appreciate that. And I feel like the umbrella is the paragraph surveillance technology. Where I get lost and confused is then we say, here's examples of surveillance technology. And then just to come back to the one I was referring to that I think equates to the drone issue is closed circuit television cameras. Okay, well, based on this conversation, that's not surveillance technology in and of itself. So now I'm like, wait, maybe I don't understand what this definition means, because the example doesn't seem to fit the umbrella definition. So that's part, so, and I don't know if maybe the thing to do is to eliminate the examples, you know? I mean, because then it's like, well, just read the words and let the words speak for themselves. Because there are things in there, I think there are more, if we did go line by line, there are more questions that get raised about whether these are all examples of surveillance technology, including the things that James raised. And then when you go into the other piece of the definition, which is B, which says surveillance technology does not include these other devices, well, some of them actually are surveillance technology per that definition. You just don't want to control it through this ordinance. So that's, again, you're saying, but that's not surveillance technology, notwithstanding what that paragraph says. So it's not clear.
If you could clarify which exempt definitions you think don't apply.
Well, I think the office, the routine office stuff would not be a surveillance technology. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you could say is not surveillance technology. I think the purpose of B should be, no, this is surveillance technology. It's just exempt. We were talking about, so you talk about 3, just as a for instance, things that are, so if we're talking about, you have manually operated, non-wearable, handheld digital cameras. Okay, so we go back to cameras, and are cameras surveillance technology per the definition if they don't have some means of identifying people built in? And then we get into, you have number 3 under B, manually operated non-wearable handheld digital cameras, Well, cell phones and tablets are capable of that too. So what's the intention relative to a cell phone or a tablet is a manually operated non-wearable handheld digital camera or audio recorder.
So they would be exempt, right? You realize B are the things that do not apply to this ordinance.
Well, it still begs the question of, are cameras per se, just a camera that is capable of recording images, is that per se, I shouldn't say per se, is that per the definition surveillance technology? Because there are cameras in each A and B, and it's not clear what the distinction is, and it's not clear from the definition that they actually are surveillance technology at all. So
yeah, I see that contradiction with the closed circuit television counting and other non-wearable handheld cameras being exempt. So I think that's definitely something to talk about here. I think the difference I see is whether something's mounted versus manually operated. But I think that's definitely something for the conversation. So I see the point that cameras are kind of in both lists there.
Mary Alice and then Jay.
So I want to step back for a second and say, Jay, I hear you in terms of setting up a process. I completely agree that we need a process in place that everybody understands and that we can put into place. When we initially had the conversation about ALPRs, we were kind of building it as we were going, and we were trying to find our way through there, and I think this is an opportunity for us to kind of set what that would look like in the future. So I think that idea is, I think it's a good one. I think that that's what this is trying to do, and I don't want to get lost in the weeds on all of this stuff. But I'm in the weeds right now, but I totally agree with the whole premise of it, I guess is what I want to say, in terms of what the process is going to be, in terms of notifying the public so that they are aware of what's going on, having a use report, having a policy, all that stuff. I'm completely behind all of that. I'm just trying to tease out some of these things. And perhaps one way to do that for Carol's question is just a rephrase of that B, which is these following items do not fall under the parameters of this ordinance.
just taking the word surveillance technology out, because I think that's the confusing part, is that they're surveillance technology, are they exempt or are they not exempt? These are just exempt items.
Jaya.
Yeah, I was going to suggest a similar point to what Mary Alice just said of clarifying the only limitation is that then we're saying this is it, right? So I think that's just a piece for us to think about, which it's not a bad starting point, but that might mean more regular revisions if there's some new technology that's covered by state law or, you know, we've determined doesn't, you know, it's an undue burden or whatever, that we might have to continue to update this list. And then going back to the other definition we were talking about, I wonder if we just need to expand it out a little bit, since it seems like there's some confusion about it. And I wonder if in the process of trying to hone in, if we got too narrow.
Well, I think if it's, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
If we're clear about the pairing, right? It's a pairing of technology with what kind of data it is. If that pair exists, then falls under that definition. That's fine with me. I was just trying to piece out all the parts of that definition, but it really truly is the pair.
Carol.
So I want to be sure that I'm clear about the pairing. Is that the technology being paired with the ability to identify, like automatically, not like human eyeballs on it? Is that true? Because there's a whole bunch of other things in the list that I think bear more discussion than that are in A that don't necessarily have that pairing.
Grace.
I think in my mind the camera example is a good one there about. I see the contradiction there, and in my mind it is that being personally identifiable. So I think maybe not quite the same as, you know, a person saying, hey, I know that person, but if we send in those images to the state facial recognition database, then I think that's where it crosses the line and would be covered because you're using that biometric data. I forgot your other part of the question.
So is it, okay. Can I just raise a couple of other ones just so we're all clear? Okay, so I don't know that this is going to be all of them, but this will be some other examples. So 10, this is under A, video and audio monitoring and or recording technology, again, such as surveillance cameras. So those, unless they're equipped with the ability to identify an individual or group, that sounds like it wouldn't actually fit the definition of surveillance technology. Surveillance-enabled or capable light bulbs or light fixtures. Those sound like just a way of masking a camera. So I would say those don't necessarily meet the definition of surveillance technology. Tools, including software and hardware used to gain unauthorized access to a mobile device. That's not surveillance technology by the definition. I should say mobile device, computer service, or computer network. I think we need to talk about social media monitoring software more, because I feel like that was a definition we needed to expand. Through the wall radar or similar imaging technology, unless that's built with something that can identify people by their whatever, I don't know how that would identify individuals or groups. Skipping over to number 16, long-range Bluetooth and other wireless scanning devices. I don't know how that is associated with any identifiable individual or group necessarily. Thermal imaging or forward-looking infrared devices or cameras. I don't know how that identifies individuals. So unless I don't understand, still, there's a lot of things that seem to me not to actually fit the definition of surveillance technology.
Jan?
Yeah, I think that feedback's helpful, and I would suggest that we review maybe previous versions of the definition, or other examples that maybe would be more expansive, because I think, the list isn't coming out of nowhere. And if it's not clear, then I think the simplest thing would be to refine our definition. That's my opinion, at least.
Grace?
Yeah, I agree. I think that is something. So it seems like there's, we are defining surveillance technology as those personally identifiable kind of markers, but there are different ones. It seems like the police department traditionally defines surveillance as physically watching someone or taking a look at their phone contents. And so I think that those options would be, yes, we could say it's strictly just personally identifiable things, or if we wanted to include in the definition, because some of these are about gaining that kind of access to someone's information, with or without authorization, and I think that might be a piece that we could work into the overall definition if we did want to keep some of those examples, because like the cell phones, that is personal information that's identifiable that we're taking from someone's phone. But some of the others might be more traditional surveillance, and I think in that sense, it's more that someone's watching without someone's consent or knowledge, like through their wall while they're inside. And so I think that there is a place for that definition of surveillance as well. Although it's different from license plate readers, it's still a non-consensual watching of someone. So I think that there might be kind of those two categories of surveillance here.
Matt, did you want in?
I was just going to add something not specifically related to the surveillance thing, but the language on defining when exigent circumstances would apply and tying it into, I think it's chapter 6 of the city code. And looking at that a little closer, and Grace, we just didn't have a chance to talk about it because I hadn't gotten that far when we met, but there's a couple things I noticed. One is that our ordinance references the 1975 Illinois Emergency Services and Disaster Act, which is no longer the law that governs that. It's the Emergency Management Act, I believe. And the definitions, I think, are a little different in terms of what's a disaster, what fits under that purview. But, it's generally widespread, large-scale events, whether it's an attack of some sort or natural disaster. I would just want to make sure that we're getting specific about, even in referencing chapter 6, what that language that says emergency situations. I think actually the pass-through reference would have to refer to disasters as they're designed under state law. So there's just some refining in that and getting specific. So there's, if the intent and council's intent is to narrow this to those kinds of things, being clear about what it includes, and that it might not include, like the example that was discussed earlier about an accident where we're wanting to use a drone, which if it's not surveillance technology, then that's kind of a moot point, but some tool, right, that we might consider using in an exigent circumstance, making sure we can capture what's in and what's out based upon, current state law. And it also highlights a need to update that section of the code. So,
go ahead, Grace.
Matt had another question too. I was wondering if you had any time to look into the thought of separating investigative stuff in the ordinance, or if you've not gotten to that yet.
Yeah. So in the draft that the administration is working on that incorporated Mary Alice's edits that kind of separate the databases from the surveillance technology, I attempted to make that distinction by, and I don't have it in front of me, and unfortunately my computer's about to die, but including what we would refer to as investigatory technology or tools in the exceptions as a way of distinguishing the two. I don't know in practice and in effect how clear that gets. I think that's a thing we'd need to discuss when we have the language in front of us, but I did make an attempt to kind of parse the two consistent with what council discussed last week in terms of trying to pull those two apart and try to deal with surveillance technology and not the investigatory stuff. But yeah.
Grace.
So I think we have some good thoughts to consider on the definitions. As you can see, I've been putting some things in red and highlighted on some things for us to think about. Don't know if there's more on here. I would be happy to just briefly go through a summary of some of the others. The main meat here, we've just got the purpose, the approval process that we would have, and this has already changed from written approval to that majority vote approval of City Council. There would be a time for City Council to have 60 days before approving something, and public input period for 45 days. We've got the section 3 has changed.
Yeah, I got you. Can you entertain a question, Grace? Okay,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Maria.
So you put in here in section 2B, you added an unredacted what does that mean? That I don't know why you would redact a surveillance technology or database use report.
This was from some input from some other attorney review. I think the point was that it's not so much that the information is unredacted, but the report itself, because sometimes we have been presenting public reports with just like everything blacked out, and it's not particularly helpful. So my interpretation of this was, the report, the main data on, maybe other cities have used it for these purposes and they've done X many things or whatever, that I think we can aggregate the data so it's anonymous and protecting people's privacy, but so that the report itself doesn't have a bunch of redactions and you don't get a FOIA request looking thing that's just a bunch of blacked out pages that's not really decipherable.
But it's a publicly available written report, so the redaction part just didn't make any sense to me because it's available to everybody. Why would we redact the use report unless you're saying that because we're not asking people to say, okay, on May 3rd, Mary Alice Wu is at the 200 West, Vine Street, right? That's not going to be in any report. It's going to be, there was, I don't know, I'm just making up numbers, 100 cars that passed University and Cunningham. That's an aggregation of it. So I don't think we would ever go down to the individual event, is what I'm saying, which would mean that we wouldn't need to redact anything. Unredacted just seems awkward, I guess is what I'm saying. I would just strip it, personally.
But also you'd say redundant, right? Because we wouldn't have any redactions in there, right? So also, it just flip side that doesn't hurt, right?
It makes it seem like you're covering something up in a publicly available written report. It seems odd to me, but that's just me.
Definitely something to consider. I would be happy to highlight it if I can. In section 3, we just looked at some of the recommended changes from James, which I think are reasonable. It doesn't significantly change the content, just gives it a different format and maybe some additions, which I think all make sense. Section 4 is about reporting and approval for existing surveillance technologies, and I think this is an important one to keep in mind also, that throughout these discussions we've come across more potentially relevant surveillance technology that's already in use in the city. So this section is talking about the approval process for existing technology. So if this ordinance were to pass, within the passing of this ordinance, there would be 120 days for any department, or maybe just the police department, to submit a use report and use policy on existing technologies that are used by majority vote of City Council. There are extension options too, that if, unless extended by council, if there's a need for more than 120 days. And then we just added in here no more than 2 extensions for any individual technology.
Mary Alice.
Can you tell me the thought process in terms of adding in no more than 2 extensions?
I think just so that things weren't caught up. There was nothing in here that really prevented an extension of, say, 3 years from now and we haven't gotten this completed.
I guess I just would remove it. I think it's unnecessary.
be happy to highlight. Yeah, so something that was recommended, again, by some other attorney input, just about having some mechanisms for certain things not being abused. I think just looking at the attorney loopholes in the legal language, like, well, what about if we have an exigent circumstance over and over again? What if we just keep doing these extensions over and over again? So I think this was through the lens of that kind of attorney looking for any potential loopholes.
Oh, go ahead, Sharice.
I guess my question would be, when you're having this kind of directed thing, no more than 2 extensions, shall be granted for any individual technology or database in use. And if they don't do it in 2 extensions, then what?
Then there would be a requirement to discontinue the use if it's not approved within, 120 days was to get all the information available, and then that starts the 60-day time period for council to approve within those no more than 60 days. So if the use report and use policy haven't passed within a total of 180 days of the passing of this ordinance, again, unless otherwise extended, says then they shall cease the use of the surveillance technology and the sharing of that data. And then there was also another clause that was added by our attorney friend that during that time period, kind of in limbo while we're waiting for approval, that we wouldn't enter into any contracts that would extend our commitment beyond that 180 days before it's approved. And that the extensions here don't have a specific amount of time, so they can be on a case-by-case basis. If one needed more time than another for some reason, that the extension timeline isn't dictated, so it could be for any amount of time that council decides on, but just saying no more than 2 extensions overall.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, James, go ahead.
Yeah, it's something that has become reasonably clear to me as we've worked through this is that there are some things that are in a gray area as to whether they're going to fit this or not. And I'd like to anticipate how something that, you know, is a technology that might potentially be considered needing to go through this. What is the mechanism if, when looking at it, when it's brought to our attention, we say, oh no, that should have been in that exemption list, or oh no, that's not fitting our definition of what should be here? Is that process going through here and the use report just saying this is not used as surveillance and here's why, and then we're done? Or is there a way out of this process when the majority of people in council say, no, this doesn't fit or does not require this whole thing happening?
Mary Alice.
So what I think you're saying, James, is that while we have a process of approving it, we should also have a process of adding it to the exempt list. Is that right?
The reason why I'm thinking about this is the state facial recognition thing that I learned about a couple weeks ago, right? So, you know, if we're using that in terms of here's a picture from an event, we need to identify this person, you know, that's a transactional investigative item, right? We might determine that that's a use that doesn't fall under this criteria. But if we were like sending all the pictures we collected from a given day and identifying who those people were, that would definitely feel like it belongs under this item. So when we look at something like that and we have that kind of moment of, oh, this is how we're using it, we see why it doesn't need to go through this multi-round process. I would expect it to be a situation that's pretty straightforward, or when it's explained, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Until you've had that. Is the way to deal with that actually going through this process and defining how it's used so that we can say, no, you don't need to do this? Or is there another exit possibility? What you said is actually also useful, Mary Alice, that if we find something that's kind of general like that and we want to add it to the exempt list, that we just do that through the process of amending the ordinance or the code. But I just, this is an involved process, and it's possible we will see something at the beginning which we realize, a staff member brings this to us and said, I'm concerned that this needs to go through this process, and we could say, no, it doesn't need to. And I don't know what that exit gate looks like in that circumstance, whether it's use the process to figure that out, or council can say, this doesn't fit, you don't need to go through this process.
Grace.
So I think that these are, all good concerns. I think that we need to know what the city is using, everything that may reasonably apply to this ordinance based on the actual current definitions. There's still some misunderstanding. I'm still not really clear on the February 3rd memo on what social media monitoring we do or don't use. So I think that that's all helpful information. So I think that we also need to have that based on kind of where we're going now so that we can think about these definitions. My understanding is that any biometrics, facial recognition stuff would count, and I think we do need to talk about it. Facial recognition software has so many racial and other concerns that I think it absolutely needs to be covered and would be under the existing definitions. I do have a section in here that I've proposed in this version, actually in 5, and I'll call this 6 that we're working on, looking at right now. But some kinds of oversight mechanism and collaboration with the commission to help relieve some of the burden and paperwork from departments using this technology, and to have some of that oversight and have some eyes on the inside that I think, James, to that point, would help, in my mind, help with defining what things do or do not kind of apply here and passing those on to council with a recommendation. But I think that we need to, like the existing technology, we can figure that out now. Like the future ones, sure, there might be new technologies developed in the future that we're not quite sure about, but I don't think we have that same excuse for existing technologies. We need to know what they are, and we can look at our definitions, and we could take them. I know we don't want to get into the weeds too much one by one on the use, but we need to, if we're making the definitions of them, I think it's totally relevant to know what we're currently using, and that's still not clear. It seems like each week there's some new thing that comes up that wasn't originally offered, and that seems to be a problem.
Mary Alice.
Based on this conversation, I feel like there's 4 things that I see here. We need to have a more in-depth conversation on the exigent circumstances and what that means. I thought we decided that it would be the city, the police department, but you say that we haven't had a vote on it, so there's the all city departments. There's the question of, do we define investigatory, and does that then become part of B? And then we need to also look at the surveillance tech definition again. Those are my 4 big things. All right?
Grace.
I think so. If I may, we just kind of go through some of the rest of this, and then that new version 8, which I think may be for a later discussion, but I think addresses some of those kinds of oversight and reporting issues. So section 5 is just saying that we, contractual stuff, that we won't sell people's data for money. We won't enter into agreements that are in conflict with our use policy for a particular technology. 6, the exigent circumstances.
Grace, can you go back up to the NDAs?
Yes.
That's new. What is that?
This was other recommendations from attorney friends. This was in some of the original the original versions, including that NDAs that the city council would have unredacted copies of contracts or other agreements for the purchase, acquisition, or use of surveillance technology, including non-disclosure agreements that are required with using it. So saying that those would be provided to city council in their unredacted complete form. I think the motivation for this is that is a tactic with a lot of these surveillance technologies, that the company has an NDA kind of wall that supersedes and blocks transparency and any other use policies. So this is just saying that the city council would have access to agreements or contracts on surveillance technology. And then in red is just adding, including non-disclosure agreements. And I think some of the original language was excluding NDAs that conflicted with our ordinance, and this is just saying that council can at least just see them. So,
Matt.
I just want to follow up. I was able to pull up the draft with the definition of investigation, or the exception that I crafted. I can read it. It'll be in a draft, but just so you have a flavor of what it would attempt to do in terms of carving out investigatory tools. It says it would be exception number 16, investigation tools or technologies intended and used for gathering specific evidence or analyzing data in order to investigate a particular crime or reported or threatened criminal activity or for any other legally authorized investigatory purpose. So that's a stab at.
Thank you. And then I just see the issue in that with the uses. So like if we say license plate readers, are we using them for surveillance or are we using them for an investigation? Both. And I think that's the issue. And so the use policy would define those allowable uses for investigations. And then if I may continue on here, we have section 6 about exigent circumstances as defined in the definitions. We can go back to maybe updating our sitting code and what our understanding of a major catastrophe emergency situation is. These are the exigent circumstances that if there is an emergency, which I think in my mind the intention is to be some kind of mass catastrophe kind of thing, that there would be an allowable use of surveillance technology for a period not to exceed 30 days, which could be extended, again, not more than 2 consecutive extensions, just so that it couldn't hypothetically be continuously saying it's an emergency situation for 2 years straight.
But that's exactly what COVID was. That was almost a 2-year emergency situation.
Yeah, so after long term, then it just goes through the approval process. So at the end of a 30-day period, maybe extended for an emergency use, then the use is either stopped or incorporated as an approved technology for the long term. That's not intended to be used continuously for an emergency. And I'm not really sure the relevance of COVID and surveillance technology use. Was there any surveillance technology that we used in response to COVID?
It's an example of an emergency that lasted more than 60 days.
Yes, and so then again, that would be after that emergency situation, then it would go through the regular approval process.
Mary Alice.
My only thing that I would say there is that I think we need to pay attention to the number of days. So you've got the number of days it's required for 60 days before the public, 45 days for gathering, and then we've got 30 days here for exigent circumstances that we're only going to we just have to add up the timeline so that we don't accidentally say, okay, we didn't meet the 60 days or the 45 days, so now we got to stop and we can't use it for another 60 days or whatever. With this piece, if the purpose is to, and I get it, I think it makes sense. If we have something that's an emergency, it should be an emergency, right? But then if it turns out to be something that we need to keep longer, then it should go through the process. I'm just trying to make sure that those timelines work together. If that makes sense.
Yes, I think that makes sense. And that there would also be a report 30 days after the end of the use for those emergency circumstances. So there would be kind of a retroactive reporting in that instance. Well, I think we talked about C, just adding some updates if necessary for the purpose of cybersecurity, but there wouldn't be any use of surveillance capabilities that might be there until there was an approved process. Number 7, we had talked about in a previous version. That's just saying that we would, if there's a violation of this ordinance, then that data would not be offered as evidence for anything, and except for violation of this ordinance. We had talked about the issue of, deleting or destroying records. We had as soon as possible, and then just added in accordance with state and federal laws. If that's hopefully sufficient for some of our retention records, that we may need to keep some, but just saying that we would not keep any surveillance data in violation of this ordinance unless we were required to, or we were providing it for evidence of the violation of this ordinance. And then also except for upon, a court order. And then section 8 here is not finished, and I would definitely be open to revisiting this one, even if we have to pass the main ordinance or put it into city code without this piece, and then add it at another time. I think that would also make sense. The words aren't great, so try not to get too focused on the words. The overall idea is, you have to put it down for a second. Don't look, the words don't make sense yet, not ready. The overall idea is that there would be an oversight from a commission. I think CPRB, Civilian Police Review Board, is one that would make sense, especially if we're talking about a lot of this applying to mostly or exclusively the police department, of having an oversight where they could help in collaboration with the annual report. In my experience, this is similar to other boards and commissions. My time on the Sustainability Advisory Commission, we work with staff on the annual climate report and action plans. It's somewhat of a collaborative process, although staff takes the main legwork in the commission, and then we just have a vote to move it on to council or committee of the whole for a vote from there. This is my understanding of how things, I think, work in BPAC and Human Relations and some other commissions and staff that have annual report requirements. So I think that it would definitely make sense that CPRB could do that role. I've had some initial conversations with a CPRB member. Obviously, we would need to talk to the whole commission, figure out some of the city departments. Matt Rushley and I also talked about that idea and some subsequent changes that would need to be made in the CPRB founding ordinance itself. From what I've heard from members of CPRB input, that this would be something that would be positive in their opinion. One, because CPRB could be more engaged. They've been just an appeals board and have been looking for ways to be more engaged. They've given us recommendations on updating their ordinance, and I think this would fall in line with giving them a useful purpose for the commission, and again, helping with our city department using the surveillance to help alleviate some of the burden in the reporting and have some of that collaboration. So the words aren't great, and I think they were kind of alternatives. So either having a collaborative process with the Civilian Police Review Board. This also says in Human Rights Commission. I don't know if we want to just pick one. I haven't talked to Human Rights Commission representatives about this yet. But I think this is also really important for someone to be able to see inside the black box, because we have some issues with self-reporting that I think have become apparent during these discussions with some of the information that wasn't offered initially and that we're finding out as we go through this process. So I think it's really important that there are eyes kind of on the inside to be sure that everything that is relevant is being covered in the way that it needs to. And I think it would be an opportunity to work collaboratively with our boards and commissions. I have in here from the ACLU model bill. They created a whole separate community advisory committee on surveillance. That's one option. I think that there's reasonable hesitation in creating a whole new committee when we have so many. So again, I think CPRB would be poised to potentially do this. But this is the example from, again, ACLU model bill. They recommend making a whole new committee on surveillance and having 3 months updates. I think they've got even the specific time period. So each year by a certain date, they'll work on this policy. I think that this might be a little much for us to create a whole new commission, but I think that the idea is really important. And again, I'd be willing to hold off on this for this first round. But would like the understanding, if we're in agreement, that we would add something like this when possible after having some of those more kind of follow-up discussions that would go along with it.
Okay, I'm gonna have the city clerk track me here if I'm getting this right. Right now, we have a motion and a second for what was brought tonight before all these other things. And we've been in discussion. And so I want to get a temperature of what, Grace, you've heard concerns about there needs to be further revisions. So what do you want to do at this point? Go ahead.
I would, I think, allowed to amend my motion to keep this in committee of the whole to go on the next committee of the whole meeting agenda. I think it was Jaya the second.
Yeah, and I would second that.
Diane, did you want to make a comment?
Just a question. Are you going to address the scope of this ordinance tonight?
Yeah, the question of is it all the city departments or is it just the police department? Do you still want to take that on?
Or not? I just am curious.
Yeah.
That will have an impact on what staff time is going to be required to review whatever version gets sent up.
Okay.
For formatting.
Oh, go ahead, Marielle.
My concern is Chandra's not here.
Okay.
I mean, I'm just throwing that out there.
Okay. James.
My sense is if we take this to committee of the whole one more time, that's going to give Grace and maybe Mary Alice some time to work on a revision. But I do want to point out that what we're trying to work to is the council's revision of what we want to have in it. And then there will be, I just want to warn people, I've heard that there needs to be another cycle once we've come to agreement on what it should be, of it being put into language for the code and making sure that we've gotten all the input from staff on the final thing that we've put together. That's what I've heard. So if individuals are thinking that we're going to, in 2 weeks, come back and have something completely ready that we're going to vote on to send to council, I think that's premature. I think we can have our part of that done, but we have to anticipate that there's going to be another cycle of getting it into the language that we would eventually pass that would become part of code.
I'd also add, what I've heard, James, too, was that after even all that, the police department was going to be allowed to do a line-by-line response to
that's staff review.
Staff review, okay.
But it will take some time depending on the scope of this ordinance.
Yeah, okay.
And it seems.
Okay. Go ahead, Grace.
I think that definitely makes sense. Open to have some input from staff. That's obviously important for people that it would directly impact in their operations and be required for some of the reporting. But I do think they go hand in hand. I think that without knowing what we're using, it's also hard to envision things on our definitions. So I would really appreciate it. And I personally don't think we have to wait until we decide every detail among council to tell us what we're using, because we still don't know all of that.
Can I?
Go ahead.
You've referred to that several times, and I don't understand what you're saying. What we're using as far as
surveillance technology.
That's what was brought in 2 weeks ago in the box.
Those are not all the things that cover the definitions that are proposed in the ordinance. There are things that weren't mentioned in there. Celebrite was not mentioned on any of these lists, had to be asked separately. Placer AI was not mentioned on those. We had a February 3rd memo attachment of 3 pages of databases that I'm still not clear if they are or are not used by the police department, and they included quite a few that said social media monitoring software, and I'm still not clear if we are or are not using those.
That's the second point we wanted to clarify tonight after we got through this ordinance itself, is there's a misunderstanding what that list was. That it was actually on the January 6th memo, that 3 pages of database. Deputy Chief Smizer can address that, because there clearly is misunderstanding in that that was just a misunderstanding from what that database actually was, or what that list of databases was. So,
Deputy
Dave.
Chief Smuser, go ahead.
Yes. So the database list that was brought forward was a list that we tried to bring together to show, for the initial reading of what was surveillance databases, how all-encompassing that definition would be. It would touch on so many areas and places and things that we use, some not very much, some not at all, some daily. And without being able to provide a better understanding of it, the list was to show it's very, very broad, the definition. So I've went back through the list, and we were very confused, Chief Boone and I, because it kept saying there's things that you're hiding, there's social media monitoring, and we had no idea what you're talking about. Looking on this list, if you took it to mean these are things that we have and use every day, I can see where you come to that realization. That is not true. There's a number of things on this list that we've never used. There's a number that we do use quite frequently, most of which are not within our control. They're databases that are controlled by the Illinois State Police, for example, the FBI, other federal agencies, things such as CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. We use that. In a sense, when we take evidence to the state crime lab, that's DNA evidence. That's not our database. That's something we have someone query on our behalf. It's very important. But going down through the list, things that we have 5 databases on this list that I would consider what we use in-house within the department. And I can go through them. First one being Carfax for police. It's Carfax. It's just we have access to it. If we need to run a VIN on a car, it gives us same stuff back you get running Carfax through that anyone has access to. Departmentware is a database. Well, it's a software system that we initially purchased to use for field training, our field training. So we keep track of our recruits as they move through the field training process and grade them. That was the initial purpose of that database. It has since grown. They have given us, they have some other offerings. Probably the one that we would use, the reason it made this list, we have an Intel bulletin function in it. So we use that for things like if we're looking for a specific person in a specific case, it allows us to put that information out to the department. It's most frequently used for photographs from places where someone has been later caught shoplifting, and we'll ask, does anybody know who this is? If you find them, it's related to this case, and write them an NTA for theft or something along those lines. We also have a LexisNexis account. LexisNexis is what we use to categorize and upload all of our traffic crash data to the state. So that's all combined in there in a database that we can then go back and query for crash reports that we've authored. IDI-Core is a newer product that replaced the one right above it, TLO. It's basically a database that we can go and query someone's name. If we're mostly used for if we're trying to locate someone and we can't find them, it gives us a potential list of places that they've either previously been known to be associated with, based on mostly things that this company is able to get through public records. And the last one we use is OffenderWatch, which is a database that we use to track, categorize sex offenders, registered sex offenders that we are required by law to oversee And they have reporting requirements and how often we need to see them, how often they need to come in, and when they're due for an annual evaluation, and when we're due to go out to their house and do a check. So some of them that I think have been brought up are things like X1 Social Discovery. It is a database. It says it collects and preserves data from social media. There are some other social media ones on here. We don't use them. We've never used them. They are available. I can see, I can come up with reasons why I would like to use them in certain situations, but it's not something that we use or even have access to at this point. If there are any specific ones on the list that you are really curious about, I mean, the list includes things like YouTube and Google. I mean, they're databases with publicly identifiable information. Some of them I didn't even think about until, you know, like the Wayback Machine. It's an internet archive. You can put information in there and see what the website looked like a year ago. So there's some uses for that for us. But you go through it, but things like LEADS, the law enforcement agency's data system, the state of Illinois runs it. We use it every single day. That's the portal that we use to get to NCIC. That's run by the FBI, and those are ones that we have no control over, but we are absolutely, they are very much necessary for our ability to function as a police department.
Grace.
I appreciate the information, and so it sounds like you're saying that we don't use this X1 Social Discovery or Data Miner or any of these other social monitoring software on this list. We do not use, have not used. Is that correct?
No.
And then I think there's also maybe a misunderstanding here. The way it's currently written, which is open for discussion, obviously, as any of this is, this does not just apply to data owned and captured by the city, but any use of surveillance technology. So meaning if we're using Champaign's license plate reader information or the university's things like that, that would also fall under the current definition. So I think that's an important point too, is that it currently is not just databases owned and operated by the city, but any of their use as well.
So may I ask a
go ahead.
clarifying question?
Go ahead.
So you're telling me if this ordinance were to pass, we would have to ask permission to ask the Champaign Police Department to check their license plate readers for a vehicle that we were looking for example?
Yes, that's very clearly laid out under these definitions, that license plate readers are a very clear example of what's listed there, and the use of that technology would fall under this ordinance. That's been very clear from every version from the get-go. It would not be for each and every specific use, it would be the general use. So we would have a report, there would be a proposed policy, and there would be allowances of we use Champaign's license plate reader data or whatever other surveillance technology data in these instances, and these are the allowable uses, and these are the ways that we don't use it.
Mary Alice.
So two thoughts there. The first one is this gets into that investigative versus surveillance delineation, if we do decide to do that delineation. If we ask, if our city asks another city, Rantoul, Champaign, whatever, hey, we had a white van have a shootout on Lincoln with a bumper sticker and the first digit of the license plate. Can you search and see if they were on your streets? That's an investigation. It's not asking them to, it's not getting access to their entire database. You're asking them for a specific piece of information. That's just up for conversation in terms of where we go with this. And the number two thing is with databases, I think that, and this was kind of what I was talking about before in the beginning, which is like what's within our control. Well, what's within our control are things that we gather and put into a database, that we have a database that we manage. And I think that, I mean, we're not going to, the reason I say this is because there's lots of different databases that we have to put things into, right, that aren't managed by us, but we're required to do so. That's part of being, you know, in the business, is that we have to put information into different systems. So what can we control? Like when we have the, it's not ARMS, what is the new system called?
Tyler.
Thank you. So we have we have a intergovernmental agreement with Champaign, Parkland, Rantoul, some other agencies where we have one instance of that, right? And that's a whole agreement between the entities in terms of what we can and cannot put in. That I would consider something that is kind of managed by the city of Urbana, because we're managing our data and how we're using that. So those are my thoughts. Those are all up for conversation and discussion.
Grace.
So again, I think that, you know, I agree, we can't control external databases. We can control our use of those databases, and that would be the point. If we're using a database that's not ours, we would dictate the use of that database and how we use it. We wouldn't be able to put any impositions on someone else's database. It would only be how we use it. And so in the use technology, the use policy for any specific technology, that's where we would say, these are times when we use it. Maybe we ask Champaign or Rantoul, or we ask our surrounding jurisdictions for access to their license plate reader data when we have a warrant, when we have consent from an individual possibly. Maybe we have the bar as probable cause. I don't know all the ins and outs. I think that's the conversation. And so that would be in the use policy, saying how we are allowed to use it for those investigative purposes, and we're not going to use it for a personal vendetta grudge or just targeting certain groups and people who go to certain places. And that's what the protections are all about. And again, this is, I think, very prudent and responsible for protecting the city as well, because there are other cities getting sued all around the country for their use of mass surveillance technology without policies and protections in place.
Okay, we are currently at a motion to put this back in Committee of the Whole, seconded by Jaya. Do we want to discuss that or take a vote on that? I could call an audible and say we'll take a vote. I'll do that, and I'm going to ask for a roll call. This is for whether or not to move all this back to committee.
Okay, keep it in committee.
Keep it in committee, yeah, right.
Councilmember Wu?
Yes.
Councilmember Evans?
Yes.
Councilmember Hersey?
Yes.
Councilmember Colasetti?
Yes.
Councilmember Wilkin?
Yes.
Councilmember Quisenberry?
Yes.
Okay, so that now goes back to committee, and I'm assuming we're done with this for now. And we are. So the next item is council input and communications. Grace.
Sorry, I did just want to say that we received an email about parking meters in town, and I thought this was an important issue that in some ways was also linked to the surveillance ordinance about parking apps being able to track people's locations as just one of the many phone tech things tracking location. But the main point about having coin operated meters. I definitely agree that this is an important part of accessibility. I think a lot of people might not have cell phones, might not have smartphones, might not have all the things that are needed to put a new app on their phone. I think it's really unwelcoming for people who are traveling from a wider area. I certainly don't want to put an app on my phone every time I travel to a new city. So I just wanted to mention that and say that I absolutely agree that I think it's an important part of inclusivity and common sense to have coin-operated parking meters and not have them all entirely go to apps. I don't really know, any mechanism for that, but I just wanted to mention that input and echo some of those concerns.
Mayor Marlin.
Yeah, we've I read that email. I believe it was related to the library, and we've answered the question in response to other people's concerns. There are coin-operated meters plus the app meters. A lot of people, and we're trying to meet the needs of both, because a lot of the population doesn't carry any coins, and we've had complaints about coin meters. So we have both types of meters at the library and at other places around town. So we'll respond to that writer and make sure they know that they're both available.
James.
Speaking of the library, I wanted to mention that this Saturday, one of our great events that we have in Lincoln Square, Read Across America, will be going on from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., and it's a good time. Kids can come and get read to, do activities, and take a free book home with them if they get all their stickers in place. So it's a good event. I hope you all can join us.
Sharice.
I wanted to acknowledge tonight that Urbana businesses closed. Urbana business closed on Friday that has been a part of Urbana for more than 60 years. Lincoln Bindery finally closed its doors. The owner of Lincoln Bindery, Chris Hahn, bought it from my parents when I was in high school. And before that, there was this very small little piece of a business that was owned by a man named Donald Alexander, who sold it to my dad. But book binderies and binding books is an art, almost like making artisan bread. And the difference is that you can't get buckram anymore, hardly. You can't get the glue that you need. You can't. You know, he and I were reminiscing over different machinery in the space and how he's had to have some of it rebuilt or refurbished. And I just want to give a hearty farewell because it's part of my history as well as the history of Urbana. I used to sweep floors, not in that building, but at the original building. And I just want to give a hearty farewell and congratulations of retirement to Chris Hahn, and I'm going to miss seeing Lincoln Bindery. It used to be called Lincoln Press Bindery, book bindery.
Okay, seeing no other comments and no other business before this body, our meeting is adjourned. Thank you.